I stood alone at my wife's burial, watching the rain wash away the fresh earth. The next day, my kids came knocking, not to mourn, but to claim the deed to our home. What my wife had hidden for me, however, ruined their entire plan. Let me explain how a lifetime of sacrifice led to a betrayal I never saw coming, and how a quiet carpenter orchestrated the most brutal legal revenge they could ever imagine. Before we begin, tell me where you are listening from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. My name is Tobias Wright. I am 69 years old. For the past 40 years, I thought I had built a legacy. My wife Evelyn and I worked tirelessly. We raised our two children, Damon and Naomi, giving them the life we never had growing up. But standing there at the edge of Evelyn's grave, the reality of what we had actually raised hit me harder than the cold November rain. The cemetery was completely empty, save for the pastor, the groundskeepers, and me. The rain fell in sheets, soaking through my dark suit, matching the heaviness in my chest. Evelyn, my partner. My compass was gone. After a long, agonizing battle with illness, she finally rested, and I was completely alone to say goodbye. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my hands slick with rain. A text from Damon. "Dad, flight is delayed. Terrible weather here. We won't make it in time. We'll call you later." Before I could even process the disappointment, another message arrived. This one from Naomi. "So sorry, Dad. Business emergency came up. Stuck at the airport. I'll be there as soon as I can. Love you." I stared at the screen, the rain blurring the words. Unavoidable business. Terrible weather. Excuses. They were just excuses. They couldn't even manage to be here for their own mother's burial. I felt a familiar ache, a dull throb of parental failure that Evelyn and I had discussed in hushed tones during her final months. We had given them everything, perhaps too much, and in return they couldn't even offer us their presence when it mattered most. I thanked the pastor, a quiet, solemn man who understood the weight of solitary grief. I walked slowly back to my car, my boots heavy with mud and sorrow. The drive home was a blur of gray skies and silent tears. When I finally parked in the driveway of our home, the house felt enormous and terrifyingly empty. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine off the rain drumming against the windshield. I needed a distraction, something to pull me away from the crushing silence of the house. I opened my phone again, idly tapping through social media. I didn't expect to find anything significant, just mindless noise to drown out my thoughts. Then I saw it. A photo posted by Meredith Damon's wife, my daughter-in-law. The image hit me like a physical blow. The caption read, "Catching some fresh powder before the storm hits Aspen is gorgeous this time of year." There they were, Damon looking relaxed and tanned in expensive ski gear, Naomi holding a flute of champagne, laughing openly at the camera, Meredith posing with her signature practiced smile, and Connor, Naomi's husband, with his arm draped casually around her. They weren't stuck at an airport. They weren't dealing with unavoidable business. They were in Aspen, drinking champagne, while I stood in the mud burying the woman who gave them life. The timestamp on the photo was glaringly obvious. 10 minutes ago. I zoomed in on the image, my eyes searching their faces for any hint of grief, any sign that they remembered what day it was. There was nothing. Just pure, unadulterated entitlement and joy. They were celebrating while I was mourning. The sorrow that had weighed me down all morning vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense heat. The pain crystallized into something sharp and precise. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was absolute freezing clarity. Evelyn had warned me. During those long nights when the pain medication wasn't enough, she had whispered her fears. "Tobias, they don't see us anymore. They only see what we can give them." I had defended them. I had made excuses. "They're just busy, Evie. They're building their lives." How foolish I had been. How willfully blind. I looked back at the house, a sprawling $1.5 million estate nestled in a quiet upscale neighborhood. We had bought it years ago, an investment that had appreciated significantly. To me, it was a home filled with memories of Evelyn's laughter, of quiet evenings by the fire. To them, it was clearly just an asset, a payday they were waiting for. I got out of the car, the rain still falling, but I no longer felt the cold. The grief was gone, replaced by a resolute, terrifying calm. I walked through the front door, shedding my wetsuit jacket. The silence of the house didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a tactical advantage. I had work to do. The rest of the day was spent in quiet preparation. I moved through the rooms not as a grieving widower, but as a man assessing his fortress. I slept fitfully that night, the image of their smiling faces in Aspen burning behind my eyelids. The next morning, the silence was shattered. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was an aggressive, relentless pounding on the front door. The kind of knocking that demands immediate attention. The kind of knocking that belongs to someone who believes they own the place. I walked slowly down the hallway, the hardwood floors cold beneath my feet. I opened the door. Standing on my porch, barely 24 hours after skipping their mother's funeral, were Damon, Naomi, Meredith, and Connor. They weren't dressed in mourning attire. They wore crisp, expensive business casual clothes. They looked impatient, irritated even. And in Connor's hand, he held a thick stack of legal documents. They hadn't come to comfort me. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come to collect. Damon did not even wait for me to speak or step aside. He pushed his way over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes, tracking dirty rainwater onto the hardwood floor Evelyn had spent countless hours polishing. He did not offer a hug to comfort his grieving father. He did not offer a single word of condolence for the mother he had just buried in absentia. Instead, he raised his arm and shoved a thick, stapled document directly into my chest. The sharp edge of the heavy paper scraped against my collarbone. I grabbed the stack instinctively before it could fall to the floor. The bold black letters across the top of the first page read, "Property Transfer Deed." Meredith followed right behind him, stepping into my home as if she were inspecting a condemned building. She did not look at me. She pinched her nose with two perfectly manicured fingers, her face contorting into a mask of exaggerated disgust. She fanned the air in front of her face as if the very atmosphere of my home was toxic. She loudly complained to Naomi that the entire place smelled like a nursing home and stale medication. Naomi did not even bother to defend the house she grew up in. She simply kept her eyes glued to the screen of her phone, furiously typing a message, completely detached from the reality of her mother passing. I looked at Damon, waiting for him to explain himself. I waited for a shred of humanity to break through his arrogant posture. He just adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket and stared at me with cold calculation. He told me to read the document and sign on the dotted line immediately. He claimed it was the most practical solution for everyone involved. The sheer audacity of his demand left a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. They had been drinking champagne in Aspen while I lowered Evelyn into the cold ground. Now, less than 24 hours later, they were standing in my foyer demanding the keys to a $1.5 million estate. I looked down at the deed in my hands. The document stipulated that I would relinquish all rights, titles, and interests in the property to a newly formed limited liability company. A company that I was absolutely certain belonged entirely to Damon and Connor. They wanted to strip me of my home. They wanted to take the only tangible piece of Evelyn I had left. I looked back up at my son and asked him if this was why he could not attend the funeral. I asked him if drawing up these papers was the unavoidable business that kept him away from his own mother's grave. Damon did not flinch. He told me that life moves on, and we needed to be pragmatic about the future. His complete lack of empathy was not just disappointing, it was monstrous. Connor stepped forward, taking charge of the ambush. My son-in-law was a man who made a living selling overpriced real estate to gullible buyers, and he brought that exact energy into my hallway. He wore a slick gray suit and a bright, predatory smile that resembled a shark circling wounded prey. He placed his hands in his pockets and adopted a tone of mock sympathy. He told me that they all loved me very much. He claimed they were deeply concerned about my well-being, living all alone in such a massive house. He insisted that the financial burden of property taxes and basic maintenance would simply be too much for a retired carpenter to handle on a fixed pension. They really believed their own lies. They looked at me and saw nothing but an uneducated man who spent 40 years hammering nails and cutting wooden boards. They assumed I had no understanding of property law, no concept of trusts, and no financial literacy whatsoever. Evelyn and I had deliberately maintained a modest lifestyle to protect them. We never flaunted our wealth because we wanted our children to learn the value of hard work and independence. That decision had completely backfired. Instead of making them humble, our restraint had made them endlessly greedy. They thought I was a weak, ignorant old man ripe for the picking. Connor dropped his fake sympathetic tone and moved straight to the threat. He told me that if I did not sign the deed over to their company today, they were prepared to take aggressive legal action against me. He pulled another document from his leather briefcase and waved it in front of me like a weapon. He stated it was a drafted petition for a court-ordered conservatorship. They were planning to go before a judge and swear under oath that my grief had triggered a severe mental decline. They were going to claim that I was a danger to myself and entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs. I listened to the smooth, calculated rhythm of his voice as he laid out my destruction. Connor detailed how a judge would easily grant them control over my life given my age and my recent tragic loss. They would freeze my bank accounts. They would force me into an assisted living facility. They would sell the house out from under me anyway, taking the profits for themselves. He framed it as a simple choice between a peaceful voluntary transfer and a humiliating public legal battle. Damon stood next to him, nodding in agreement. Naomi finally looked up from her phone to add that I should just make it easy on everyone and sign the paper. They were threatening to declare me legally incompetent. They were perfectly willing to destroy my dignity, my autonomy, and my reputation, all for a quick payout. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not show them the burning rage churning inside my chest. I could not let them see the sharp, calculating engineer they never knew existed. I had to give them the exact performance they expected from a defeated old man. I let my shoulders sag heavily. I bowed my head, allowing my chin to rest near my chest. I made my breathing shallow and slightly erratic. I let my hands shake visibly as they held the stack of hostile legal documents. I became the broken, grieving, intimidated victim they had designed this morning ambush for. I looked at Damon with wide, fearful eyes. I kept my voice low, forcing a raspy tremor into my words. I told him that this was all happening so fast. I whispered that I did not understand these complex legal terms and that my head was spinning from the funeral yesterday. I carefully avoided making direct eye contact with Connor, acting as though his legal threats had completely terrified me into submission. Meredith rolled her eyes and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of impatience. She told Damon to just give me a pen so they could get this over with and go get brunch at their favorite spot downtown. I took a slow, unsteady step backward. I told them that I could not read the fine print without my glasses. I mumbled that I needed to go to Evelyn's study to find them and promised I would be right back. I shuffled away from the foyer, dragging my feet slightly across the hardwood floor to sell the illusion of frailty. I could hear Connor chuckling quietly behind me. I heard Damon tell the others to relax because I was about to cave completely. They were entirely convinced that they had broken me. They thought their coordinated ambush had worked flawlessly. I reached the door to Evelyn's study. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. I reached up and turned the solid brass lock. The heavy click echoed in the quiet room, sealing me off from the vultures waiting in my hallway. The moment the lock engaged, the facade vanished. I stood up straight, my shoulders squared. The fabricated tremor in my hands stopped instantly. The terrified, grieving widowers ceased to exist. I looked around the quiet study, my mind shifting into absolute razor-sharp clarity. They thought they had backed a tired old carpenter into a corner. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to dismantle their entire lives piece by piece. I walked to the center of Evelyn's study boots, silent on the thick Persian rug. The room held the faint scent of her lavender perfume mixed with old paper. It was her sanctuary where she managed the invisible empire we built in secrecy. I knelt and grasped the woven edge of the rug, pulling it back to expose the pristine oak floorboards underneath. 40 years as a structural engineer taught me to hide things in plain sight. I retrieved my pocket knife. The steel blade flipped open with a snap. I traced the seam of a floorboard 3 feet from the mahogany desk. To an untrained eye, it was just another piece of timber. But I installed this floor myself, creating a microscopic gap designed for my blade. I wedged the knife into the seam and applied precise downward pressure. The hidden locking mechanism disengaged with a metallic click. I pried the custom board upward, revealing a dark cavity reinforced with steel casing. Inside rested a heavy biometric safe. It was a piece of security technology Damon and Naomi would never expect an uneducated retired carpenter to possess. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green glass scanner. The machine beeped, reading my fingerprint before the steel door hissed open on pneumatic hinges. Inside, stacked neatly, were the physical manifestations of Evelyn's brilliant mind. She knew our children were circling like vultures, waiting for her heart to stop beating so they could gorge themselves on our wealth. She prepared a counteroffensive now securely in my hands. I reached into the safe and pulled out the first of several black leather-bound ledgers. I carried the heavy ledgers over to Evelyn's mahogany desk and flipped open the covers. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, bank routing codes, and transaction histories printed in crisp black ink. These were the complete financial records of our covert corporation. Evelyn and I formed this corporation decades ago, quietly investing our earnings into commercial real estate and high-yield index funds. We grew our wealth silently, ensuring they would never rely on our money. But as my eyes scanned the highlighted columns, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The ledgers proved a devastating reality. Damon and Naomi discovered a vulnerability in the corporate accounting structure a year ago when Evelyn's health declined. The records showed a relentless drain of capital. My children had been embezzling massive sums of money directly from our family funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were funneled into dummy accounts to finance their fabricated luxury. Damon's tailored suits penthouse apartment and the Porsche he flaunted were bought with stolen money. Naomi's designer handbags, her constant vacations, and the capital keeping Connor's failing real estate business afloat were entirely funded by their theft. They were not successful professionals. They were parasitic criminals, draining their mother's lifeblood while she lay dying. I placed the ledgers aside, my jaw clenched tight. Reaching back into the safe, I pulled out the final document. It was a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I broke the seal and slid the parchment onto the desk. The bold heading read, "The Ironclad Trust." I read through the dense legal terminology, marveling at Evelyn's foresight and protective ferocity. She anticipated their greed. She knew they would try to seize control the moment she was gone. This trust was a legal masterpiece. It explicitly revoked all previous wills, entirely disinheriting Damon and Naomi. More importantly, it transferred absolute, unchallengeable power of all financial assets, real estate holdings, and corporate entities exclusively to me. It contained a dead man's switch clause that fortified my ownership against claims of mental incompetence. I was now the sole dictator of a multi-million-dollar empire, and they had absolutely no idea. I stood perfectly still in the quiet study, holding the ultimate weapon in my hands. The Ironclad Trust was not just a legal document. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at the fragile, stolen foundations of my children's lives. They were standing outside this very door, threatening to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my freedom, completely unaware that I now held the power to eradicate their entire existence with a single phone call. The grief that paralyzed me at the cemetery yesterday was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They declared war on an old man they thought was defenseless. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about respect and consequence. I carefully returned the ledgers to the biometric safe, ensuring they were stacked exactly as Evelyn left them. I kept the Ironclad Trust out, placing it securely inside the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket, resting it right against my heart. I closed the heavy steel door, letting the pneumatic hinges seal it, and lowered the custom oak floorboard back into its microscopic seam. I rolled the vintage Persian rug back into its original position, smoothing out the fabric until there was absolutely no trace of the hidden compartment beneath it. I took a deep breath, slowing my heart rate. I needed to transition back into the character they expected to see. I pulled out my wire-rimmed reading glasses. I slid them onto my face, pushing them slightly down the bridge of my nose to make myself look older and vulnerable. I let my shoulders slump forward again, curving my spine to project an image of physical defeat. I focused my mind on the overwhelming exhaustion I had felt at the cemetery, allowing my facial muscles to relax into a mask of intimidated sorrow. I willed my hands to start trembling slightly, rehearsing the nervous movements of a man backed into a corner by his own vicious children. I picked up the unsigned property transfer deed from Evelyn's desk, holding the thick stack of papers in my shaking hands. I walked toward the heavy oak door and unlocked the solid brass deadbolt with a loud, deliberate click. I pulled the door open slowly, keeping my head bowed low as I stepped back out into the bright hallway. Damon, Naomi, Meredith, and Connor were still standing exactly where I left them, wearing identical expressions of smug impatience. Connor crossed his arms over his chest, his predatory smile returning the moment he saw my defeated posture. Damon let out a loud sigh, looking at his expensive stolen watch as if my grief was a terrible inconvenience to his schedule. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, refusing to meet their arrogant gazes. I extended my trembling hands forward, offering the thick stack of legal documents back to my son. I cleared my throat, forcing a weak, pathetic rasp into my vocal cords. I told Damon that these papers were incredibly confusing and that the legal words were making my tired head spin. I whispered that the funeral completely drained my energy and that my eyes were too blurry to read the fine print today. I begged him with a fabricated, shaking voice to please just give me a few days to read the documents thoroughly before I signed anything. Damon snatched the thick stack of papers from my outstretched hands with a harsh jerk. A triumphant smirk spread across his face, entirely convinced that my fabricated display of weakness was genuine surrender. He adjusted his expensive, stolen silk tie and looked down at me with absolute, unyielding contempt. He told me to take all the time I needed over the weekend, but warned me that his patience had strict limits. He expected my signature notarized by Monday morning, or Connor would file the conservatorship petition with the family court before noon. Meredith let out a sharp, mocking laugh, complaining loudly that she could not spend another second breathing the stale air inside my house. Connor patted Damon on the shoulder, congratulating him on a successful negotiation, completely blind to the trap they had just walked into. Naomi did not even look up from her smartphone. She simply turned around and led the procession out the front door, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished oak floorboards. I stood motionless in the foyer, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped until I heard the heavy front door slam shut. I listened closely as their footsteps faded down the front steps. The loud, aggressive roar of Damon's sports car engine ignited in the driveway. I waited until the sound of their tires scraping against the wet asphalt completely disappeared down the street. The moment the house fell completely silent, the pathetic, trembling old man vanished once again. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of my performance. I walked briskly to the front door and engaged all 3 deadbolts with firm, satisfying clicks. The house was now a fortress, and it was entirely secure from any intruders. I marched directly back into Evelyn's study. I bypassed the hidden floorboard compartment entirely. Instead, I reached under the bottom drawer of her mahogany desk, feeling for the hidden magnetic latch we had installed years ago. I pulled the concealed drawer open. Resting inside on a bed of velvet was Evelyn's private tablet. This device was completely detached from our regular home network. It was a secure, encrypted terminal she used exclusively to monitor the financial arteries of our covert empire. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated instantly, requesting a complex alphanumeric passcode. I typed the precise sequence flawlessly. The home screen materialized perfectly before me. The moment the secure banking portal connected to the global network, a relentless cascade of push notifications began sliding down from the top edge of the illuminated screen. The system had been offline since the morning of Evelyn's passing, and the sudden influx of data created a rapid sequence of sharp digital chimes echoing in the quiet study. I tapped the red alert icon, opening the master transaction log for Evelyn's most exclusive line of credit, the ultra-premium titanium black card. The account history loaded immediately, displaying a horrifying, uninterrupted string of exorbitant purchases. My weary eyes scanned the brightly colored merchant names and the massive numerical figures attached to each recent transaction. The geographical location data showed that these purchases were not happening online. They were physical point-of-sale transactions occurring right now at a luxury retail plaza downtown. A fresh push notification pinged on the glass. $2,000 had just been authorized at a high-end cosmetics boutique. 60 seconds later, another alert materialized. $5,000 was successfully processed at an exclusive imported shoe retailer. Naomi was currently executing a massive, uninhibited shopping spree using her dead mother's primary financial asset. A surge of disgust tightened my chest as the timeline of her theft became glaringly obvious. Naomi had not simply found the card lying around the house this morning. The transaction history proved the card had been active for several days. She had explicitly and maliciously stolen the titanium card from Evelyn's leather handbag weeks ago, right when her mother was heavily medicated and confined to her hospice bed. She had shamelessly exploited the chaos of her own mother's agonizing final days to silently siphon our wealth. While I was sitting in the dimly lit hospital room holding Evelyn's fragile hand and praying for a miracle, my daughter was sneaking through her purse like a common pickpocket. Another notification dropped onto the screen, bolder than the rest. Naomi had just walked into the most expensive designer boutique in the city. The application displayed a pending authorization request. She was attempting to charge $12,000 for a collection of luxury handbags and imported silk garments. The absolute sheer entitlement of her actions was staggering. She skipped the solemn funeral, claiming she was stranded due to unavoidable business, yet here she was parading through high-end retail stores, spending our hard-earned capital without hesitation. I picked up my smartphone and immediately dialed the concierge line printed on Evelyn's secondary card. The call connected instantly to a senior wealth management representative. I maintained a steady tone, identified myself, and provided the necessary security clearances. I formally notified the bank that my wife had passed away. I instructed him to permanently lock the primary account and freeze the credit portfolio immediately. The representative offered condolences and confirmed the security protocol was actively engaged. The authorization signal to the boutique would be fundamentally rejected. I severed the connection, knowing the consequences rippled across the city almost instantly. Across town, inside the blindingly bright showroom of the designer boutique, the scene unfolded exactly as I calculated. Naomi stood arrogantly at the marble checkout counter surrounded by glossy shopping bags and pristine leather goods. She carelessly tossed the stolen card across the polished stone surface, expecting the transaction to vanish seamlessly into our wealth. The meticulously dressed cashier swiped the heavy metal card through the terminal. A harsh electronic rejection beep instantly shattered the quiet upscale atmosphere of the store. The cashier frowned, attempting to process the payment a second time, but the machine displayed a glaring red error code. The cashier looked up, her professional smile dissolving into a look of cold suspicion. She handed the heavy metal card back to my daughter and announced loudly enough for the surrounding wealthy patrons to hear perfectly that the account was officially flagged as deceased and permanently frozen. Naomi froze the blood rushing to her cheeks as several affluent shoppers turned to stare at her. Her arrogant posture crumbled into sheer unadulterated public humiliation. She stammered frantically, attempting to provide a logical excuse, but the damage was irreversible. The cashier firmly requested another form of payment, knowing full well Naomi possessed zero personal capital to cover a $12,000 invoice. Naomi snatched the useless card from the counter, abandoning her luxury merchandise, and practically sprinted toward the glass exit doors to escape the judgmental stares of the retail staff. Back in the absolute silence of my study, I set my phone down on the mahogany desk. I interlaced my fingers, leaning back in my chair with quiet, terrifying patience. The first financial artery had been completely severed. My spoiled daughter was currently experiencing the harsh, freezing reality of poverty, and I knew exactly what her next move would be. Less than an hour later, the front door violently burst open. The heavy oak slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crash that echoed through the quiet house. Quick, furious footsteps stomped down the hallway. Naomi marched directly into the kitchen. Her face was flushed bright red with sheer indignation. She did not bother to remove her damp designer coat or her mud-stained heels. She stomped right up to the marble kitchen island where I sat quietly reading a newspaper. She raised both of her hands and slammed her fists down onto the polished stone surface. The coffee cups rattled sharply against their saucers. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with unprecedented fury, completely discarding any pretense of familial respect or common decency. She screamed at me, her voice shrill and trembling with rage. She demanded to know what exactly I had done to her mother's credit account. She yelled that she was standing at the register of the most exclusive boutique in the city when the cashier loudly announced her payment was declined and the account was frozen due to a deceased flag. She described the humiliation of having the luxury shopping bags ripped from her hands while other wealthy customers pointed and whispered. She accused me of deliberately trying to sabotage her life out of sheer petty spite. She paced frantically back and forth across the kitchen floor, throwing her arms up in the air as she continued her aggressive tirade. She claimed that Evelyn had given her explicit permission to use that titanium card for living expenses and mourning preparations. I knew this was an absolute fabricated lie. Evelyn would never authorize her daughter to spend thousands of dollars on designer handbags while she was on her deathbed. Naomi pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. She demanded that I pick up my phone immediately, call the banking concierge, and authorize the reactivation of the credit line. She insisted that I owed her a massive apology for putting her through such a deeply traumatizing and humiliating public ordeal. I watched her throw this massive temper tantrum like a spoiled, ungrateful child who had just been denied a shiny toy. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I just sat perfectly still on my wooden stool, quietly observing the total collapse of her carefully constructed false facade. I slowly lifted my delicate ceramic porcelain cup from its saucer and took a long, deeply measured sip of my warm chamomile tea. I let my hands shake just slightly as I lowered the cup back down to the island. I widened my eyes and adopted the persona of the bewildered, grieving widower they believed me to be. I told Naomi in a soft, trembling voice that I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. I gently reminded her that her mother had just passed away, and that major global banking institutions possess automated algorithms that constantly monitor state mortality registries. I explained to her using simple terms as if I were a confused old man that the bank must have flagged the primary credit account automatically the exact second Evelyn's death certificate was officially filed into the state public system. I insisted that I did not call anyone to sabotage her shopping trip today, and that I was simply sitting here mourning my beloved wife. Naomi stopped pacing. She glared at me with pure, unfiltered disgust. The mask of the loving daughter completely disintegrated before my eyes. She leaned over the kitchen island once more, her face mere inches from mine, and delivered the most venomous insult she could muster. She called me a pathetic, uneducated carpenter who had spent 40 years riding the coattails of her brilliant mother. She stated that I was nothing but a useless parasite who contributed absolutely zero value to this family's immense wealth. She yelled that the only reason I was allowed to live in this magnificent estate was because Evelyn had foolishly taken pity on a struggling blue-collar worker all those decades ago. Her words were deliberately engineered to inflict maximum emotional damage and completely shatter my dignity. I absorbed every single cruel syllable without breaking character. I lowered my gaze to the floor, acting thoroughly broken and humiliated by her vicious verbal assault. I nodded slowly, pretending her devastating words had successfully crushed my spirit into dust. Satisfied that she had established her intellectual and social superiority, Naomi scoffed loudly, snatched her expensive damp designer coat off the nearby chair, and stormed out of the kitchen. I listened to her angry footsteps retreat down the hallway until the heavy front oak door slammed tightly shut once again. The kitchen fell silent, and I smiled a cold, victorious smile. My moment of silence was violently interrupted by the sharp ringing of my phone resting on the marble counter. I glanced at the brightly illuminated screen. It was Damon calling. I accepted the call and held the mobile device to my ear, ensuring my voice retained that pathetic, beaten-down tremor they now expected from me. Before I could even mutter a fragile greeting, Damon began speaking with aggressive, unfiltered hostility. He did not ask how I was coping with Naomi's explosive visit. Instead, he loudly announced that his patience was completely exhausted. He informed me that Connor was personally bringing a licensed property appraiser to the house this exact afternoon to officially expedite the sale process. Damon commanded me to stay out of their way, unlock the front gate, and let the professionals handle the valuation of the estate without any ignorant interruptions from a retired carpenter. He demanded total compliance, threatening once again to expedite the legal conservatorship petition if I dared to obstruct their swift financial progress. I responded with a perfectly calculated, trembling whisper, assuring him that I would unlock the gates and stay quietly hidden in the kitchen. I immediately hung up the phone and dropped the frightened victim act. The time for passive defensive maneuvers was entirely over. I quickly navigated to my encrypted contacts and dialed the private cellular number for my attorney, Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was a ruthless legal titan who had secretly orchestrated Evelyn's ironclad trust documents. He answered almost instantly. I gave him a rapid, highly detailed briefing of the morning's volatile events, including the impending arrival of the real estate appraiser. Jonathan understood the assignment flawlessly, confirming that he was preparing the ultimate legal trap for my deeply corrupt children. I ended the call and walked directly toward my personal toolkit hidden in the hallway closet. I retrieved a highly sensitive voice-activated micro-recorder no larger than a common postage stamp. I walked into the grand living room, a space meticulously decorated with Evelyn's antique furniture. I knelt down beside the sprawling mahogany coffee table positioned precisely where Connor and his corrupt appraiser would undoubtedly sit to discuss their fraudulent property valuation scheme. I securely taped the tiny black recording device directly underneath the center of the wooden table, ensuring it was completely invisible to the naked eye. The trap was now fully armed and waiting to spring. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy iron security gates at the front of the estate buzzed open. I watched from the kitchen window as a sleek black sedan pulled up the long circular driveway. Connor stepped out first, wearing an excessively tailored suit, adjusting his silk tie with an air of absolute ownership. From the passenger side emerged a man who looked entirely out of place in this upscale neighborhood. He wore a cheap wrinkled blazer and carried a battered clipboard. He did not possess the sharp professional demeanor of a certified real estate appraiser. He moved with the nervous, shifty energy of a small-time hustler looking for a quick payout. Connor led him up the front steps and let himself in using the spare key he had aggressively demanded from me months ago. I stood quietly near the hallway archway, keeping my hands clasped tightly together, playing the role of the intimidated, grieving old man perfectly. Connor did not greet me. He simply pointed at the high vaulted ceilings and told the appraiser to start taking notes. The appraiser, a man introduced only as Vance, began his theatrical performance immediately. He walked around the grand living room, aggressively tapping the solid oak support beams with the back of a metal pen. He clicked his tongue loudly, shaking his head with an exaggerated expression of deep concern. He claimed the primary load-bearing walls were severely compromised by extensive unseen termite damage. He pointed to a microscopic natural hairline settlement crack near the fireplace mantel and loudly declared it was a catastrophic symptom of a failing foundation. He jotted furious, chaotic notes on his clipboard, announcing to Connor that the structural integrity of the entire estate was essentially non-existent. He stated that the property would require hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate critical remediation just to meet basic municipal safety codes. He declared the house a toxic liability, dramatically slashing its appraised market value from $1.5 million down to a paltry $400,000. Connor crossed his arms, looking at me with a fabricated expression of deep sympathy. He sighed heavily and claimed it was a profound tragedy that Evelyn let the house fall into such a horrific state of dangerous disrepair. They were aggressively attempting to panic me into selling the pristine family property for absolute worthless pennies today. I listened to Vance confidently spew his fraudulent technical jargon, and it took every ounce of my willpower to suppress a cold, cynical smile. For 40 years before I adopted the quiet life of a retired hobbyist carpenter, I operated as a high-level commercial structural engineer. I had designed suspension bridges, supervised the construction of skyscraper foundations, and consulted on municipal earthquake reinforcements across the state. I knew the molecular tensile strength of every single wooden beam, steel bracket, and concrete piling inside this home. I personally supervised the pouring of this foundation, ensuring it exceeded every known commercial safety standard. The microscopic settlement crack they pointed out was merely cosmetic paint separation, a completely harmless and common symptom of seasonal humidity shifts. There were absolutely no termites, no rotting joists, and no structural deficits anywhere on this property. It was built like an impenetrable fortress. Yet, these two arrogant con artists were standing in my living room lecturing a master engineer about load distribution using completely fabricated terminology. They genuinely believed I was a senile, uneducated old fool who would blindly accept their absurd evaluation. I did not correct them. I did not raise my voice to defend the immaculate integrity of my home. Instead, I maintained my submissive posture, letting my shoulders slump even lower under the imaginary weight of their alarming diagnosis. I nodded slowly, widening my eyes to feign complete panic and overwhelming distress. I whispered that the news was deeply devastating and asked Connor what my options were if the house was truly in such terrible condition. Connor smiled, his predatory shark smile, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He smoothly replied that he could leverage his industry connections to find an investor willing to buy the property, as is saving me from a massive financial disaster. I thanked him with a shaky, fragile voice, acting profoundly grateful for his supposed generosity. I offered to fetch them both glasses of cold iced tea from the kitchen so they could comfortably finish their paperwork in the living room. Vance eagerly agreed, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a successful scam. I turned my back to them, shuffling my feet across the floorboards. I walked into the kitchen, prepared the iced tea, brought the glasses back to the ornate coffee table, and quietly excused myself from the room. I walked out the back door, stepping onto the rear patio overlooking the manicured gardens. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, opened the encrypted security application, and connected directly to the live audio feed, transmitting from the micro recorder hidden beneath the living room coffee table. The digital connection was flawless, delivering crystal-clear audio directly into my earpiece. The moment I left the room, the fabricated professional atmosphere completely dissolved. Connor and Vance erupted into loud, triumphant laughter. I listened as ice clinked against the glass while they celebrated how incredibly easy it was to deceive the grieving old man. Connor enthusiastically praised Vance for his convincing performance regarding the non-existent termite damage. They openly discussed their malicious real estate flipping scheme in explicit detail. Connor revealed that he had already established a phantom shell company registered under a fake name. Their plan was to force me to sell the estate to this shell company for the dramatically undervalued price of $400,000. Once they legally seized the property deed, Connor would immediately relist the house on the premium market for its true value of $1.5 million. They planned to split the massive fraudulent profit between them, leaving me utterly homeless and financially ruined. I recorded every single syllable of their criminal conspiracy directly onto my secure cloud server. The evidence of intentional real estate fraud was now undeniable and absolute. However, the sickening amusement in their voices was suddenly interrupted by the heavy thud of the front door opening. Sharp clicking heels echoed across the foyer hardwood, signaling Meredith's arrival. Connor immediately hushed the appraiser. Meredith stormed into the living room, her tone impatient and remarkably aggressive. She demanded to know if the fake appraisal was finished because she was entirely exhausted by the slow pace of their financial extraction. Connor assured her the trap was set, but he complained that I might still be too stubborn to sign the final transfer papers quickly enough. The audio feed captured the chilling sound of Meredith sighing with deep, calculated malice. She told Connor that relying on a fake appraisal was a complete waste of time. A much darker, far more sinister conversation began to unfold. Meredith lowered her voice, bringing a terrifying new strategy to the table. She coldly announced that they needed to bypass my consent entirely by chemically destroying my sanity. I stood frozen on the rear patio, the crisp afternoon breeze entirely failing to cool the sudden burning heat radiating through my veins. Through the tiny earpiece, Meredith's voice echoed with a chilling clinical detachment. She dismissed Connor's fraudulent real estate flipping scheme as amateurish child's play. Why wait for a stubborn old man to read contracts when you can simply erase his ability to think entirely? She asked the room. I listened, my grip tightening around my smartphone as my daughter-in-law outlined a conspiracy so vile it bordered on attempted murder. She confidently announced that she had already procured a highly potent black market supply of heavy prescription sedatives. Her plan was devastatingly simple and entirely ruthless. She intended to visit the house under the guise of bringing me home cooked meals to comfort my grieving soul. Instead of nourishment, she planned to crush the heavy tranquilizers into a fine powder and dissolve them directly into my food and my morning chamomile tea. She enthusiastically described the severe neurological side effects of the specific chemical compound she had acquired. Within 48 hours of continuous ingestion, the high-dose sedatives would completely dismantle my cognitive functions. I would experience extreme lethargy, profound disorientation, and severe memory fragmentation. She laughed a sharp, soulless laugh, bragging that I would be left staring blankly at the walls, drooling and unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. She told Connor that physical intimidation and fake appraisals were completely unnecessary when you can simply hijack the target's central nervous system. I listened to this woman, someone I had welcomed into my family and treated with nothing but absolute respect, casually plot to poison my food. She was not just planning to steal my financial assets. She was aggressively plotting to strip away my fundamental human dignity, my memories of Evelyn, and my capacity to navigate reality. The sheer, unadulterated evil in her voice was paralyzing. She bragged about how easily she could manipulate the dosage to ensure I remained in a permanent compliant fog without triggering a fatal overdose that might attract police attention. The meticulous, calculated nature of her chemical assault proved this was not a spur-of-the-moment desperate idea. She had been researching and preparing this toxic intervention for weeks. My blood ran absolutely cold as the front door opened once again. Heavy footsteps echoed through the audio feed as Damon finally entered the living room to join his wife and brother-in-law. He did not ask if the fake appraisal was successful. He immediately demanded an update on the medical timeline. Meredith proudly repeated her poisoning strategy, assuring her husband that the chemical foundation of their hostile takeover was fully operational. Damon let out a loud sigh of deep relief. He proudly announced to the group that the legal component of their medical conspiracy was firmly secured and ready to be executed. He revealed that he had officially placed a highly corrupt, unlicensed private psychiatrist onto his personal payroll. This fabricated medical professional was a shadow operator known for providing forged clinical evaluations to desperate families looking to seize trust funds and inheritances prematurely. Damon explained the exact sequence of their devastating legal strike. Once Meredith successfully drugged me into a state of semi-conscious compliance, Damon would bring his hired fraud into my home. The corrupt doctor would conduct a sham evaluation lasting no more than 5 minutes. He would immediately sign a binding sworn medical declaration stating that I was suffering from severe advanced stage dementia and acute paranoid schizophrenia. Damon boasted about the exorbitant sum of cash he had already transferred to the fake doctor to guarantee a bulletproof, unquestionable diagnosis. He explained that a sworn affidavit from a recognized medical authority was the absolute gold standard in family court. No judge in the state would ever question a professional psychiatric evaluation, especially when combined with my drugged, incoherent physical appearance. Damon confidently assured the room that with that single forged document, the court would instantly grant him full, uncontested emergency conservatorship over my entire life. He would gain immediate, unchecked access to my bank accounts, the authority to sell the estate and the legal right to force me into a low-budget psychiatric lockdown facility against my will. He chuckled darkly, stating that once I was securely locked behind padded doors, they could finally liquidate the family assets and live the luxury lifestyle they truly deserved. I stood on the patio, absorbing the full, horrifying reality of my son's ultimate betrayal. He was not just stealing my money. He was aggressively financing a criminal operation designed to legally erase my existence and lock me away in a chemical prison until the day I died. At that exact moment, every single lingering ounce of paternal guilt entirely evaporated from my soul. Any microscopic hesitation, any fragile hope that my children were merely misguided or desperate, was permanently eradicated. They were not struggling adults making poor choices. They were ruthless, calculating predators actively orchestrating my physical and psychological destruction for personal financial gain. The father who had raised them, protected them, and loved them unconditionally, officially died on this patio. In his place stood a master tactician armed with irrefutable evidence and driven by a cold, righteous fury. I terminated the live audio connection. I immediately accessed the secure interface on my smartphone and initiated a mass data transfer. I copied the massive high-definition audio files containing their complete criminal conspiracy. I uploaded the pristine recordings to 3 separate, heavily encrypted cloud storage drives located on different international servers. I was ensuring that no matter what physical actions they attempted to take against me, the damning evidence of their extortion, real estate fraud, and attempted chemical assault would survive and eventually reach the authorities. I slipped the smartphone deep into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, letting it rest right beside Evelyn's ironclad trust document. I did not bother to return to the kitchen. I did not want to spend another second breathing the same air as the monsters plotting my demise inside my own living room. I walked briskly around the manicured perimeter of the grand estate, bypassing the main house entirely. I reached the detached 3-car garage and slid into the leather driver's seat of my heavy utility vehicle. I ignited the powerful engine, the low mechanical rumble matching the intense, unyielding determination vibrating within my chest. I pressed the remote button to open the rear service gate, exiting the property without alerting the criminals celebrating inside. I gripped the steering wheel firmly, my knuckles turning white against the dark leather. I merged onto the main highway, accelerating aggressively toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. I was not driving to a police station to file a standard report. I was driving straight to the executive offices of Jonathan Pierce. I was bringing my ruthless legal shark the exact ammunition he needed to unleash a completely unprecedented, financially devastating war against my own flesh and blood. I drove straight into the heart of the downtown financial district, pulling my heavy utility vehicle into the subterranean parking garage of Pierce & Associates. I bypassed the receptionist entirely, taking the private elevator directly to the top floor. Jonathan Pierce was standing behind his expansive glass desk when I entered his corner office. He was a ruthless corporate attorney, a man whose tailored suits hid the instincts of an apex predator. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I walked straight across the polished hardwood floor, placed my smartphone onto the center of his desk, and pressed play. Jonathan listened in absolute silence. His sharp eyes narrowed as Meredith's cold voice detailed her strategy to chemically erase my sanity using black market sedatives. His jaw tightened when Damon bragged about bribing a corrupt psychiatrist to forge a severe dementia diagnosis for family court. When the recording finally finished, Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. He shook his head, stating that in 30 years of practicing law, he had never heard a family conspiracy so brazenly vile. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and withdrew the thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I slid the ironclad trust across the glass desk. Jonathan broke the seal, scanning the documents with rapid precision. A dangerous, predatory smile slowly spread across his face. He looked up at me and announced that it was time to officially activate Evelyn's final protocol. He explained the mechanics of the dead man's switch embedded within the trust architecture. By filing this specific legal injunction today, Jonathan would permanently lock the estate and all corporate assets under my sole, uncontestable jurisdiction. Any future medical declarations of incompetence produced by Damon or his fraudulent doctor would be immediately nullified by federal estate law. My children had lost the legal war before they even filed their first motion. We had successfully fortified the castle, but I was not interested in merely playing defense. I instructed Jonathan to go on the offensive. I wanted to dismantle their entire existence from the foundation up. Jonathan immediately summoned his lead forensic accountant into the office. I authorized full access to Evelyn's covert corporate funds and banking networks. The directive was simple and absolute. I wanted a complete microscopic autopsy of Damon and Connor's financial lives. I wanted to know exactly how much they owed, who they owed it to, and where their vulnerabilities were hiding. The accountant went to work hacking through public records, credit histories, and shell company filings with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, the results were delivered to my secure email server. The reality of their financial situation was far more pathetic than I had ever imagined. Damon and Connor were not successful businessmen. They were desperate drowning frauds. They had heavily leveraged their properties, maxed out multiple lines of credit, and completely exhausted traditional banking resources. To maintain their luxurious facades, they had turned to the shadows of the financial world. The forensic report proved they owed massive high-interest debts to a ruthless syndicate of dangerous private lenders and aggressive venture capital groups. They were millions of dollars in the red, running a massive Ponzi scheme that was days away from total collapse. This was the true reason they needed to steal my estate so urgently. If they did not secure a massive influx of capital within the month, their dangerous creditors would strip them of everything they owned. I called Jonathan back with a new devastating directive. I ordered him to use our covert limited liability company to aggressively approach every single one of their private lenders. I instructed him to purchase their bad debt portfolios entirely in cash, paying a premium to acquire the promissory notes immediately. Money was no object in this war. The transaction was swift, entirely legal, and completely lethal. By the end of the week, the massive acquisitions were finalized. I was no longer just their grieving father. I was their sole absolute creditor. I legally owned the mortgages to their penthouses. I owned the titles to their luxury vehicles. I owned the crushing debt of their failing businesses. I held their complete financial survival in the palm of my hand, and I was fully prepared to crush it into dust. I returned to my quiet estate, my mind calibrated for total destruction. The house was empty, secure behind the new deadbolts I had installed earlier that week. As I walked into the grand foyer, I noticed a piece of heavy premium cardstock resting on the entryway console table. It was a gilded invitation printed with extravagant gold foil lettering. I picked it up, reading the elegant cursive font with a profound sense of disgust. Damon was hosting a formal event at my house this coming Saturday evening. The invitation brazenly labeled the event as a memorial dinner to honor Evelyn's legacy. However, the guest list enclosed within the envelope revealed a much darker agenda. He had not invited family friends or Evelyn's old colleagues. He had invited over 100 elite real estate investors, wealthy venture capitalists, and municipal zoning officials. Damon and Connor were using my wife's death as a morbid networking opportunity. They planned to bring these wealthy investors into my home, fill them with expensive champagne, and officially pitch the demolition of my estate to build their fabricated luxury condominiums. They actually believed they were going to finalize their hostile takeover, while I sat quietly in the corner, thoroughly sedated by Meredith's black market tranquilizers. I tossed the gilded invitation onto the table. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering, but it provided me with the absolute perfect stage for my retaliation. I did not call Damon to protest. I did not alert the authorities to stop the gathering. I welcomed the audience. I walked slowly down the hallway and entered my expansive walk-in closet. I bypassed the row of casual sweaters and faded denim jeans they expected the old carpenter to wear. I reached the very back of the cedar wardrobe and pulled the protective canvas cover off a flawless midnight blue bespoke suit. I ran my fingers along the premium Italian wool, checking the immaculate stitching of the lapels. I selected a crisp white silk shirt and a solid crimson tie. I polished my heavy leather Oxford shoes until they gleamed like dark mirrors. I was going to let them fill my house with the most powerful people in the city. I was going to let them stand on their podium and build their tower of lies, and then I was going to burn it to the ground. Saturday evening arrived with a fleet of luxury black sedans and valet attendants crowding the circular driveway of my estate. By 7 o'clock, over 100 of the city's most elite real estate developers, venture capitalists, and municipal zoning officials filled my grand living room and formal dining area. They carried crystal flutes of imported champagne and balanced delicate hors d'oeuvres on fine china plates, completely ignoring the fact that they were standing inside a grieving widower's home. The atmosphere was not solemn or respectful. It was a loud, aggressive networking event masquerading as a memorial service. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays while a hired string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. I stood near the hallway archway observing the sickening spectacle of my wife's memory being exploited for a cheap corporate cash grab. Meredith found me quickly. She marched over with her jaw clenched tight and her eyes flashing with severe irritation. She carried a horribly frayed moth-eaten gray wool cardigan she must have dug out of a donation bin. She shoved the scratchy garment into my chest and ordered me to put it on immediately. She hissed that my standard dark suit looked entirely too sharp and would ruin the narrative of the confused, helpless old man they had meticulously sold to their wealthy investors. She demanded I look the part of a fragile victim. I did not argue. I slipped the ugly, oversized cardigan over my shoulders, intentionally, letting it hang loosely to satisfy her insulting aesthetic requirements. Satisfied with my manufactured, pathetic appearance, Meredith pointed a manicured finger directly toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. She coldly instructed me to grab a stool, sit in the corner next to the industrial dishwashers, and remain absolutely silent for the rest of the night. She threatened that if I wandered into the main hall and embarrassed her in front of the municipal zoning commissioners, Damon would finalize the psychiatric lockup by Monday morning. I nodded slowly, bowing my head to project total submission. I shuffled quietly toward the kitchen doors, playing the obedient broken elder perfectly. I took my assigned seat on a cold metal stool next to a stack of dirty catering trays. I waited patiently in the shadows, listening to the loud, arrogant chatter bleeding through the heavy wooden double doors until it began. At precisely 8 o'clock, the string quartet ceased playing. A sharp tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal flute commanded the room. I pushed the kitchen door open a fraction of an inch to observe. Connor and Meredith stood confidently on a raised wooden podium installed in front of the marble fireplace. Damon and Naomi flanked them, holding drinks with practiced postures. Meredith gripped the microphone first. She manufactured a fake look of sorrow across her face. She offered a short toast to Evelyn's memory, describing my brilliant wife as a simple woman who loved gardening. The disrespect of reducing a corporate strategist to a domestic caricature made my jaw clench. The crowd raised their glasses, politely swallowing the hollow tribute. Before the guests could even lower their arms, Connor stepped forward and seized the microphone. He aggressively pivoted the tone. He flashed his predatory smile and announced that while they honored the past, tonight was fundamentally about building a lucrative future. He clicked a remote and a projection screen unrolled from the ceiling. High-definition architectural renderings illuminated the room, displaying a massive luxury condominium complex entirely replacing my historic estate. Connor projected his voice with the slick cadence of a con artist. He boldly told the investors that the plot of land they were currently standing on was effectively secured. He lied flawlessly, claiming the current owner was transferring the deed into their corporate portfolio by the end of the weekend due to failing health. He detailed an aggressive demolition timeline, confidently stating that bulldozers would arrive to tear down these walls by the 1st of next month. He threw out fabricated profit margins, promising venture capitalists astronomical returns on their early investments. He invited the elite crowd to bid on the ground floor opportunity to construct the most exclusive residential tower in the district. The wealthy guests nodded approvingly, murmuring in greedy agreement. Connor was auctioning off the roof over my head, while I sat mere feet away. He possessed absolute confidence in his fraudulent presentation, believing his path to a multi-million-dollar payout was completely unobstructed. I sat in the dim kitchen, listening to his arrogant voice bounce off the high ceilings of my home. My patience had finally reached its absolute definitive expiration point. I slowly stood up from the cold, hard metal stool, fully ready to end this highly insulting charade permanently. I reached up and gripped the collar of the frayed gray cardigan Meredith had forced upon me. I pulled the scratchy garment off my shoulders and threw it onto the catering trays. Beneath that pathetic costume, I was wearing my flawless midnight blue bespoke suit. I adjusted the crisp cuffs of my white silk shirt and smoothly tightened my crimson tie. I rolled my neck, releasing the manufactured hunch that had defined my posture for the past week. I stood at my full height, adopting the commanding presence of a man who controls a vast corporate empire. I pushed the heavy kitchen doors open simultaneously. They swung outward with a loud bang that immediately drew the eyes of the guests standing near the back of the hall. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly down the center aisle of the living room. I did not shuffle or tremble. I marched with heavy, deliberate footsteps. The wealthy investors standing in my path instinctively stepped aside, sensing the overwhelming wave of authority radiating from my frame. Damon caught sight of me first. The arrogant smirk instantly drained from his face, replaced by sheer panic. Naomi gasped, audibly spilling champagne onto her designer dress. They did not recognize this version of their father. I reached the podium just as Connor was detailing the estimated demolition costs of my master bedroom. I did not wait for him to finish his fraudulent sentence. I stepped forcefully onto the platform, ignoring his shocked expression. I reached out and violently snatched the microphone directly out of his hand. The sudden movement caused a sharp blast of static feedback to screech through the speakers. Connor stumbled backward, his slick composure entirely shattered. Meredith stood frozen beside him, her face contorted in absolute terror as she stared at my immaculate suit. I gripped the heavy microphone tightly and turned to face the expansive crowd of elite real estate developers and greedy venture capitalists. The loud chatter that had filled the room evaporated. Over 100 wealthy guests stared at me in breathless silence, captivated by the dramatic interruption. You could have easily heard a single pin drop onto the polished hardwood floor. I looked directly at the investors in the front row, projecting absolute, undisputed power. The trap was now officially sprung tonight, and I was finally fully prepared to watch their entire fraudulent empire burn down. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for the sudden interruption to your scheduled programming. My name is Tobias Wright. I am the sole owner of this estate and the primary shareholder of the corporation you were just aggressively pitched. I welcome you to my home. I hope the champagne has been to your liking. My voice did not shake. It resonated through the high ceilings with the polished, heavy cadence of a chief executive officer taking command of a hostile boardroom. The trembling, frail widower was completely gone. In his place stood a man who had spent 4 decades negotiating massive commercial infrastructure contracts. The absolute shock in the room was palpable. The wealthy investors in the front row lowered their champagne flutes, staring at me with a mixture of intense curiosity and sudden apprehension. They instantly recognized the undeniable tone of genuine authority. I turned my gaze toward my children. Damon stood paralyzed near the edge of the marble fireplace. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to comprehend the impossible transformation unfolding right in front of his eyes. Naomi gripped the edge of the catering table, her knuckles turning stark white. The sheer panic in her eyes was immensely satisfying. They had expected an uneducated push over who would cower in the kitchen. They were now facing an apex predator who had quietly observed their every move. Connor attempted to recover his slick composure. He lunged forward, reaching for the microphone, and tried to force a nervous laugh. He told the audience that I was simply confused by grief and gently ordered me to return to the kitchen. I did not step back. I did not yield an inch of ground. I looked Connor directly in his eyes and delivered a look so intensely cold that it physically stopped him in his tracks. I firmly told him to step down from my podium immediately, or I would have him forcefully removed for trespassing. Connor swallowed hard, taking a slow, cautious step backward. The entire facade of their lucrative business presentation was actively disintegrating. I addressed the crowd once again. I informed the elite investors that the development project they were just sold was entirely built on a foundation of malicious criminal fraud. I announced that no demolition permits had been filed because the true owner of the property never consented to a single word of this illicit transaction. To prove my point beyond any shadow of a doubt, I retrieved my smartphone from the inner pocket of my bespoke jacket. I swiped the screen and accessed the secure cloud server where I had meticulously stored my arsenal of digital evidence. With a single deliberate tap, I wirelessly paired my device to the massive smart television mounted directly behind the wooden podium. The bright architectural renderings of their fake luxury condominiums instantly vanished from the screen. They were replaced by a stark black background displaying a simple audio playback graphic. I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear recording of Connor and Vance, the fraudulent appraiser, echoed loudly through the premium surround sound speakers. The entire room listened as Connor laughed arrogantly, boasting about how incredibly easy it was to deceive a grieving old man. They heard Vance admit that the property possessed absolutely zero structural flaws and that his fabricated termite damage report was entirely fictional. The audio feed captured Connor explicitly outlining his malicious scheme to force me into selling the $1.5 million estate to their anonymous shell company for a pathetic fraction of its true value. He detailed his exact plan to immediately flip the stolen property and pocket the massive fraudulent profit while leaving me completely homeless and financially ruined. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the crowd of elite real estate developers and venture capitalists. These were shrewd, ruthless business people who despised being manipulated or legally compromised. They instantly realized that Connor was attempting to entangle them in a highly illegal multi-million-dollar real estate scam. Outrage began to ripple through the audience. Several prominent investors aggressively set their crystal flutes down on the nearest tables, shaking their heads in absolute disgust. A wealthy municipal zoning official standing near the front row loudly demanded to know what kind of criminal operation Connor was running. Connor stood completely frozen on the platform, sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the spotlight. His slick, predatory confidence had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate fraud. He stammered frantically, trying to shout over the damning audio recording, claiming that the tape was heavily doctored and completely taken out of context. The investors were not buying a single word of his pathetic excuses. The room was rapidly turning against them, and the hostile takeover was officially dead. I let the recording play until the final sickening laugh faded into silence. Meredith could no longer handle the catastrophic destruction of her social and financial ambitions. The absolute public humiliation triggered a sudden violent break in her composure. She lunged forward with a piercing, hysterical scream, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding the investors ignore the audio recording. She desperately shouted that I was a severely mentally ill patient suffering from advanced dementia who had completely lost touch with reality. She loudly proclaimed that I was paranoid, dangerous, and entirely incapable of understanding the truth. I did not flinch as she continued her frantic, aggressive tirade. Instead, I reached inside my tailored suit jacket one final time. I pulled out a thick manila folder containing the exhaustive psychiatric profile and the forged medical declarations they had purchased from their corrupt black market doctor. I raised the heavy folder high in the air for the entire audience to witness. I forcefully threw the documents across the large marble table. The heavy pages slid across the smooth surface and scattered right at Meredith's designer shoes. I leaned into the microphone and projected my voice over her hysterical screaming. I announced to the room that the documents currently resting on the floor were entirely fabricated by an unlicensed doctor they had illegally bribed. I revealed with cold surgical precision that my daughter-in-law had aggressively planned to secretly dissolve high-dose black market sedatives into my daily meals. I explicitly exposed their vile chemical conspiracy to artificially induce a state of severe cognitive decline just to legally seize my assets. The sheer magnitude of this horrifying revelation struck the audience like a physical shockwave. The murmurs of disgust instantly escalated into loud, angry shouts of pure condemnation. Investors physically backed away from Meredith as if she were a highly contagious disease. The disgust on their faces was absolute and unyielding. Damon realized their entire meticulously crafted world was violently burning down to the ground. His professional facade collapsed into sheer panicked desperation. He frantically pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He dialed 911, raising his voice over the angry crowd. He demanded that the police secure his location, sealing his ultimate legal doom. Damon held the phones to his ear, shouting his address to the emergency dispatcher, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. He demanded immediate police intervention, claiming a hostile intruder was threatening his guests. I stood perfectly still behind the polished oak podium, watching his pathetic display of desperation. He genuinely believed that law enforcement would arrive to save his fraudulent empire. He thought the authorities would drag me out of my own home in handcuffs. The elite investors surrounding the perimeter of the grand living room began to murmur nervously. The sophisticated upscale networking event had completely devolved into a volatile, unpredictable crime scene. Several prominent venture capitalists aggressively checked their luxury watches, signaling their urgent desire to flee the premises before the situation escalated further. Before a single siren could wail in the distance, the massive double doors of the main entryway swung violently open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the interior walls with a thunderous crack that instantly silenced the anxious crowd. The frigid night air rushed into the foyer. Striding confidently through the threshold was Jonathan Pierce. My attorney did not look like a standard family lawyer. He moved with the calculated, predatory grace of a corporate assassin. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal pinstripe suit, clutching a sleek black leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my children's lives. Flanking Jonathan on either side were two massive, heavily armed private security contractors. These were not local mall rent-a-cops. They were imposing tactical professionals dressed in sterile black uniforms equipped with heavy utility belts and communication earpieces. Their sheer physical presence radiated immediate, uncompromising authority. The wealthy guests instinctively parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the room. Jonathan marched directly toward the marble fireplace, his polished leather shoes echoing rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The armed contractors followed in perfect synchronization, their eyes scanning the room and neutralizing any potential threat with a single hardened glare. Connor took a cowardly step backward, attempting to hide behind the catering table. Meredith stood entirely frozen, her manicured hands trembling as she stared at the imposing tactical guards. Damon lowered his smartphone slowly, the emergency operator's voice still buzzing faintly from the tiny speaker. The cavalry had officially arrived, but they were not here to rescue my corrupt children. They were here to execute my absolute legal supremacy. Jonathan stopped directly beside the wooden podium. He did not offer a polite greeting or apologize for the dramatic intrusion. He simply placed his leather briefcase onto the polished surface and popped the twin silver latches. With highly practiced efficiency, he extracted a thin digital tablet and a bundled stack of official notarized documents. I stepped aside, yielding the floor to the legal architect of their impending doom. Jonathan tapped his tablet wirelessly, overriding my previous connection to the massive smart television mounted above the mantel. The screen flickered instantly, replacing the damning audio interface with a crisp, high-definition scan of a highly complex legal document. The bold, undeniable header displayed the words, "The Ironclad Trust." Jonathan adjusted his designer glasses and addressed the room with a voice that cut through the tension like a surgical scalpel. He introduced himself as the senior managing partner of Pierce & Associates and the exclusive legal counsel for the Evelyn Wright estate. He pointed a firm finger at the glowing screen. He announced to the crowd of elite developers and zoning officials that the luxury condominium project they were aggressively pitched tonight was a complete fabricated delusion. He stated with absolute legal certainty that neither Damon Wright nor Connor possessed a single shred of equity ownership or developmental rights to this property. Jonathan tapped his screen again, displaying the official state-verified property deed. He loudly clarified the exact legal reality of the situation. He declared that Tobias Wright was the sole, undisputed, and absolute owner of this $1.5 million estate. The crowd gasped as Jonathan unleashed the final devastating piece of legal ammunition. He revealed that I was not merely a retired carpenter. He announced that I was the primary shareholder and supreme executive of a multi-million-dollar covert real estate holding corporation, the very corporation that effectively owned the titles to the lucrative commercial properties Damon and Connor falsely claimed as their own. The revelation struck the room with the force of a freight train. The investors stared at me with newfound profound respect and immediate apprehension. The fragile narrative of the senile, uneducated old widower was completely eradicated. I was a wealthy, highly strategic corporate titan who had just flawlessly outmaneuvered two pathetic, arrogant con artists. Jonathan slammed his fist onto the podium to emphasize his final point. He declared that any contracts signed, any verbal agreements made, and any checks written to Connor this evening were legally void and constituted active participation in felony financial fraud. The wealthy guests gasped again, their eyes darting angrily toward Connor. They realized how dangerously close they had come to being indicted in a massive federal scam. The absolute severity of their catastrophic failure finally shattered Damon's arrogant facade. The reality that he had just attempted to defraud over 100 of the city's most powerful financial elites crashed down upon him. He looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving with sheer panic. He saw the furious glares of the venture capitalists. He saw the cold, unyielding presence of the armed security contractors. The fight-or-flight response violently hijacked his nervous system. Damon spun around, shoving his way past a stunned waiter, and sprinted desperately toward the grand entryway. He was abandoning his wife, his sister, and his criminal partner, seeking only to save his own pathetic skin from the incoming legal slaughter. I did not raise my voice. I did not chase after him. I simply looked at the lead tactical security contractor standing near the archway and gave a short, sharp nod. The contractor moved with terrifying speed. He crossed the foyer in 3 massive strides, easily intercepting my fleeing son. The guard planted a heavy gloved hand squarely onto the center of Damon's chest, violently halting his forward momentum and shoving him backward into the hallway. Damon stumbled his expensive designer shoes, slipping against the polished oak floorboards. He fell hard onto his hands and knees, thoroughly defeated and physically contained. I stepped back up to the microphone, my voice radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. I ordered the security team to secure the perimeter and engage the heavy brass deadbolts on the main double doors. The loud metallic clanking of the locks echoed ominously through the grand living room. I looked directly down at my son, who was currently cowering on the floor, and swept my gaze across the terrified faces of Meredith, Naomi, and Connor. I declared with chilling precision that nobody was leaving this house until the ledger was completely balanced. The elite investors in the room immediately understood the gravity of the situation. They were witnessing a ruthless, highly calculated corporate execution. With a synchronized, unspoken agreement, the wealthy guests physically stepped backward. They retreated toward the edges of the room, creating a wide, isolating circle of empty space around my 4 treacherous children. The investors crossed their arms, entirely abandoning Damon and Connor to their inevitable fate. The social and professional isolation was instantaneous and absolute. My children were now trapped inside a locked fortress, surrounded by furious witnesses facing a man who held the absolute power to systematically annihilate their entire existence. The trap was fully sealed, and the final phase of their total financial destruction was officially initiated. I stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the center of the room where my children stood isolated and trembling. I looked at Damon, who was still trying to push himself up from the hardwood floor, his designer suit wrinkled and pathetic. I looked at Naomi, her face stained with ruined makeup and sheer terror. I made sure my voice carried across the dead silent room, speaking not just to them but to every elite investor who had witnessed their arrogant charade. I told them that for 40 years their mother and I had deliberately chosen to live a modest, unassuming life. We drove older vehicles, we bought our clothes from standard department stores, and we never flaunted a single dime of our immense capital. I explained that this was not because we lacked the resources, but because we fundamentally understood the toxic, corrosive nature of unearned wealth. We knew that handing them a fortune on a silver platter would completely destroy their drive, their ambition, and their moral compass. We constructed this massive financial empire in the shadows specifically to protect them from becoming the exact kind of greedy, entitled parasites they had ultimately chosen to become anyway. I stated that my poverty was nothing but a carefully engineered facade. It was a test of their character, a measure of their fundamental human decency. I told them that instead of showing respect or gratitude for the life we gave them, they chose to view my perceived weakness as an opportunity to strike. They looked at the father who raised them and saw only a vulnerable target waiting to be exploited. I informed them that they failed this test in the most spectacular, morally bankrupt way imaginable. They proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that they were entirely unworthy of carrying the family legacy. The wealthy guests in the room listened in absolute stunned silence as I dismantled the false narrative my children had built their entire lives upon. I told Damon and Naomi that they had spent decades resenting me for not giving them luxury, completely blind to the fact that I actually possessed the power to buy their entire world 10 times over. I was not the naive carpenter they mocked behind closed doors. I was the architect of their existence, and I was deeply, profoundly disgusted by the monsters they had become. I turned my attention to Jonathan Pierce, extending my right hand without breaking eye contact with my son. My attorney immediately stepped forward and placed 2 thick, heavy manila folders directly into my palm. I walked right up to Damon and Connor, the heavy sound of my footsteps echoing against the tense silence of the grand living room. I forcefully shoved the first folder into Damon's chest, making him stumble backward, and slapped the second folder directly into Connor's shaking hands. I ordered them to open the files and read the top pages aloud to the audience. They fumbled with the clasps, their eyes scanning the dense legal text. The remaining color instantly drained from their faces. I did not wait for them to find their voices. I announced to the room that these folders contained the original notarized promissory notes to every single massive high-interest loan they had secretly acquired over the past 5 years. I revealed that my forensic accountants had spent the last 48 hours conducting a microscopic audit of their financial lives. I exposed the undeniable truth that neither Damon nor Connor were successful businessmen. They were desperate, heavily leveraged frauds drowning in a sea of toxic debt owed to ruthless private lenders. I explained that they had maxed out their credit-leveraged properties they did not own, and operated a failing scheme that was days away from a catastrophic implosion. Then I delivered the ultimate lethal blow. I proudly announced that the anonymous venture capital firm that had aggressively purchased every single one of their bad debt portfolios earlier this week was a subsidiary entirely owned and operated by my primary corporation. I informed them that I had bought their loans in cash, paying a premium to acquire the paper immediately. I told Damon and Connor that their dangerous, shadowy creditors no longer held their survival in their hands. I was now their sole absolute creditor. I legally owned the mortgages to their luxury penthouses. I held the titles to their expensive sports cars. I possessed the crushing debt that funded their entire fabricated reality. They stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, finally realizing the inescapable trap closing tightly around their throats. I had not merely protected my own assets. I had systematically purchased the absolute ownership of their entire financial existence. I did not give them a single second to process the monumental scale of their defeat. I raised my voice, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of absolute destruction. I officially declared that as their primary and sole creditor, I was immediately calling in every single outstanding debt in full effective right this exact second. I announced that due to their multiple severe contractual defaults and documented fraudulent misrepresentations, I was initiating the immediate seizure of all their corporate and personal assets. I ordered Jonathan Pierce to execute the pre-filed court injunctions instantly. I loudly proclaimed that their personal bank accounts were now officially frozen. Their business assets were seized pending liquidation. The luxury vehicles parked in my driveway were now legally my property. I told them that they were completely stripped of every dime they falsely claimed to own. The elite real estate investors surrounding us reacted instantly to my declaration. These wealthy venture capitalists realized they had been pitched a fraudulent project by two men who were now officially bankrupt and facing massive federal litigation. A prominent developer in the front row reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out the preliminary investment contract Connor had handed him earlier, and ripped the document cleanly in half. He tossed the shredded paper onto the floor in absolute disgust. Within seconds, a wave of tearing paper echoed through the grand living room. Every single wealthy guest who had considered funding their scam aggressively destroyed their agreements, throwing the pieces onto the hardwood floor like garbage. The social and professional execution was total. Damon fell to his knees, clutching the manila folder as he realized his entire life had just been erased in a matter of minutes. Connor clutched his chest, hyperventilating as his real estate empire evaporated into thin air. Naomi and Meredith stood frozen, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of their sudden brutal poverty crashed down upon them. They had walked into my home expecting to steal a $1.5 million estate from a helpless old widower. They were now standing in the center of the room with absolutely zero assets and zero future. I looked down at the four of them, completely devoid of any paternal sympathy or mercy. They were utterly ruined, entirely bankrupt, and totally dependent on my next command. The suffocating silence in the grand living room finally shattered. It broke not with a plea for mercy, but with a sharp, echoing crack of physical violence. Meredith lunged forward and slapped Damon forcefully across the face. The harsh impact whipped his head to the side, leaving a bright red handprint perfectly outlined against his pale, terrified skin. Her pristine country club demeanor completely evaporated. She stood over him, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with absolute unhinged fury. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his chest and screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. She called him a pathetic, broke fraud. She shrieked that she had wasted the best years of her life married to a hollow failure who could not even successfully secure his own inheritance. Damon remained on his knees, too stunned by his total financial annihilation to even defend himself against his furious wife. Meredith paced wildly across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking sharply against the timber. She loudly listed every single luxury they were about to lose. She mourned the penthouse, the country club memberships, the imported cars, and the exotic vacations. She did not mourn her marriage. She did not express a single ounce of regret for conspiring to poison her father-in-law. Her entire existence was defined by material wealth, and I had just evaporated every single dollar to her name. Damon finally found his voice, stammering weakly that they could simply file for bankruptcy and rebuild their lives from scratch. Meredith let out a harsh, venomous laugh that bordered on total hysteria. She told him that she would never spend another day attached to a man with negative capital. She ripped her diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it violently at his chest. The heavy platinum jewelry bounced hard off his expensive ruined suit and clattered uselessly onto the floor. She screamed that he promised her a $1.5 million estate and instead delivered a massive mountain of toxic debt. She declared their marriage officially dead, right there in front of the remaining elite investors. The wealthy venture capitalists watched the spectacular implosion with sheer morbid fascination. Damon scrambled desperately on the floor, searching for the discarded diamond ring as if it could somehow salvage his crumbling reality. His humiliation was absolute. He was a ruined man crying on his hands and knees. The chaos violently spread across the room as the second partnership completely self-destructed. Connor turned his predatory rage directly toward his own wife. He lunged at Naomi and violently shoved her shoulders. The sudden, forceful impact knocked her completely off balance, making her stumble backward and crash hard onto the polished hardwood floor. Her expensive silk dress bunched up around her knees, but Connor offered absolutely zero sympathy or assistance. He stood over her, casting a dark, threatening shadow. He pointed an aggressive finger at her face, blaming her entirely for feeding him completely false intelligence. He roared that she promised him her father was a weak, uneducated tradesman who possessed absolutely zero financial literacy. He screamed that he staked his entire professional reputation and his entire real estate brokerage firm on her guarantees. Naomi pushed herself up onto her elbows, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, thick streams. She screamed right back at him, her voice cracking with desperation and unbridled panic. She blamed him for executing a sloppy, transparent real estate scam. She yelled that if he was truly a competent broker, he would have verified the property titles himself instead of blindly trusting assumptions. Connor, pacing like a caged animal, shouted that she was the one who stole the titanium credit card and triggered the initial financial lockdown. They continued to tear each other apart, verbally exposing every single dirty secret of their fraudulent marriage. They aired their dirty laundry loudly, ensuring every elite investor in the room knew exactly how incompetent and malicious they truly were. Connor shrieked that Naomi was a useless, spoiled brat who contributed absolutely nothing to their joint bank accounts. Naomi retaliated by mocking his failing business, declaring that he was a pathetic scam artist who preyed on vulnerable senior citizens to make a quick buck. They exchanged vicious, deeply personal insults without any hesitation or remorse. The entire illusion of their wealthy, sophisticated lifestyle burned down to ash. They were nothing more than two desperate, broke criminals fighting over the scraps of a failed heist. Naomi threw her luxury handbag at Connor's head, missing entirely and shattering a crystal vase against the stone fireplace. Connor cursed loudly, pulling at his hair as he realized his real estate license was effectively destroyed. The wealthy investors watched the brutal blame game unfold, recognizing that these four individuals were entirely toxic and completely ruined. I stood perfectly still with my hands clasped behind my back, watching the violent unraveling of their fraudulent alliance. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or paternal remorse for the spectacular destruction happening right in front of me. I remained entirely cold, acting as a silent, calculating spectator to their vicious, self-inflicted annihilation. The union of thieves had finally turned their sharp daggers upon each other, tearing their respective marriages apart under the heavy, crushing weight of absolute poverty. They were actively destroying themselves, and I simply allowed the toxic fire to burn until there was absolutely nothing left but ash. Suddenly, the piercing, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens shattered the tense atmosphere inside the house. Red and blue emergency lights violently flashed through the tall living room windows, illuminating the panicked faces of my ruined children. The heavy front doors swung open again, allowing 3 uniformed police officers to step into the grand foyer. They had arrived rapidly in direct response to the frantic 911 emergency call Damon had foolishly placed earlier that evening. Damon scrambled to his feet, his torn suit hanging from his shaking frame. He desperately ran toward the arriving officers, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest. He shrieked hysterically, demanding that the police immediately arrest me for criminal trespassing and severe mental instability. He screamed that I was a highly dangerous hostile intruder who had violently hijacked his exclusive memorial dinner event. He begged the officers to drag me out of the estate in handcuffs, hoping against logic that law enforcement could magically restore his shattered financial empire. I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my hands defensively or attempt to explain my position to the responding authorities. Jonathan Pierce calmly stepped forward, intercepting the lead police officer. My attorney handed the officer the official notarized property deed and the federal court injunctions verifying my absolute legal ownership of the estate. The lead officer carefully reviewed the documents, his stern expression hardening as he grasped the undeniable legal reality of the situation. He looked up from the paperwork and completely ignored Damon's frantic, unhinged screaming. The 3 heavily armed police officers walked purposefully straight past me, completely bypassing my position. They marched directly toward Damon and Connor, their hands firmly resting on their utility belts, ready to execute my ultimate legal command. The lead police officer stopped directly in front of Damon. He did not reach for his handcuffs immediately, but his hand rested securely on his radio. Jonathan Pierce stepped up beside the officer and handed over a crisp stack of freshly printed documents. These were official court-approved trespassing notices specifically detailing that Damon, Naomi, Meredith, and Connor were no longer welcome on this property. The officer reviewed the documents carefully, noting the state seal and the absolute clarity of the legal language. He looked back up at Damon, who was still trembling on his knees, and ordered him to stand up. The officer announced in a loud, commanding voice that the 4 of them were officially trespassing on private property. He informed them that the owner of the estate, Tobias Wright, had formally requested their immediate removal. Damon tried to argue, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at me. He claimed that this was his childhood home and that he had a legal right to remain inside the building. The police officer did not entertain his pathetic excuses. He placed his hand firmly on Damon's shoulder and told him that the paperwork proved otherwise. The officer stated clearly that they had exactly 2 minutes to gather their personal belongings and exit through the front doors, or they would be arrested for criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. Naomi began to cry hysterically, clinging to her torn designer dress. She begged the officers to listen to her, claiming that I was stealing their inheritance. The second police officer stepped forward, blocking her path to me. He calmly but firmly instructed her to stop shouting and move toward the exit. Meredith, completely stripped of her arrogant country club persona, scrambled to her feet. She did not look at Damon. She did not offer him a hand. She simply grabbed her expensive purse from a nearby chair and hurried toward the foyer, desperate to escape the humiliating glare of the elite investors who were still watching from the perimeter of the room. Connor tried to smooth his ruined suit jacket, his face pale and sweating profusely. He attempted to negotiate with the officers using his slick real estate broker voice, but the third officer simply pointed toward the open double doors. The command was absolute and entirely non-negotiable. They had to vacate my private premises immediately without delay. The 4 dragged their feet across the foyer, heads bowed low under the crushing weight of total defeat. Damon pulled out his electronic car keys, pressing the unlock button. A sleek silver Porsche chirped brightly from the circular driveway outside. Naomi similarly retrieved her keys, signaling her pristine white Mercedes parked right next to it. They intended to climb into their luxury vehicles and speed away from the scene of their catastrophic failure. I stepped directly into their path, blocking the large double doors before they could cross the threshold. I raised my right hand palm facing outward and commanded them to stop immediately. I looked at the lead police officer and calmly informed him that those 2 specific vehicles were not their personal property. I turned back to them, my voice echoing coldly across the floor. I declared that the Porsche and the Mercedes were technically purchased and fully registered under Evelyn's primary limited liability company. Since the Ironclad Trust legally transferred absolute ownership of that entire corporate entity directly to me, those cars were now officially my exclusive property. Damon stared at me, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of unadulterated panic. He protested loudly, arguing that his mother bought that car for him as a birthday present 5 years ago. I did not raise my voice, but my response was razor sharp. I reminded him that a verbal gift did not supersede a corporate title deed. He had never bothered to transfer the legal registration into his own name because he wanted the company to continuously pay for his expensive insurance premiums and regular maintenance costs. His laziness and greed had just secured his ultimate downfall. Naomi clutched her keys tightly to her chest, shaking her head in frantic denial. She shrieked that she absolutely needed her car to get back to her downtown apartment. I looked at her with zero sympathy and suggested she call a taxi. The lead police officer stepped between us, holding out his open hands. He looked at Damon and Naomi with a stern, uncompromising glare. He ordered them to surrender the keys immediately, stating that taking corporate vehicles without the documented owner's permission constituted grand theft auto. Faced with the immediate threat of felony arrest, Damon reluctantly dropped his Porsche keys into the officer's hand. Naomi cried loudly as the officer firmly pried the Mercedes keys from her trembling fingers. The police officer handed the 2 sets of luxury car keys directly to Jonathan Pierce, who slipped them securely into his jacket pocket. I stepped aside, finally clearing the path to the heavy oak double doors. The armed security contractors moved forward in perfect synchronization, creating a rigid physical barrier that guided my ruined children toward the threshold. Damon was the first to cross the frame, his shoulders slouched and his spirit completely broken. Connor followed closely behind him, constantly looking back over his shoulder at the furious investors who were still actively glaring at him from the center of the living room. Meredith walked stiffly, holding her expensive handbag tight against her chest, her face a pale mask of sheer unadulterated shock. Naomi brought up the rear, sobbing loudly as her designer heels clicked unsteadily against the stone porch outside. The moment they stepped onto the exterior landing, a sudden, violent crack of thunder echoed through the dark sky. The heavens opened up, unleashing a torrential freezing downpour across the entire estate. It was an exact poetic visual mirror of the miserable weather I had endured while standing completely alone at Evelyn's freshly dug grave just days prior. They had no umbrellas. They had no luxury vehicles waiting in the driveway with the heaters running. They were forced to descend the wide marble steps and walk entirely on foot down the long, winding asphalt driveway toward the main wrought iron security gates. The heavy rain instantly soaked through Damon's tailored suit and plastered Meredith's perfectly styled hair flat against her face. The freezing water ruined their expensive clothes and washed away the very last remaining fragments of their arrogant pride. I stood perfectly still in the warm, dry foyer, watching their miserable, drenched silhouettes slowly fade into the darkness of the stormy night. They were finally experiencing the exact level of cold, isolating abandonment they had so carelessly inflicted upon me during my darkest hour of grief. I did not feel a single ounce of remorse for the brutal reality they were now facing. I reached forward and firmly grabbed the brass handles of the oak doors. I pushed them inward, bringing the 2 thick wooden panels together with a resounding definitive slam. The deadbolts engaged with a sharp click. The sound of the rainstorm was instantly severed. Profound silence returned to the house, bringing me absolute, unbreakable peace. Exactly 1 week passed since the heavy oak doors of my estate slammed shut, sealing my absolute peace. In those 7 short days, the financial and social architecture of my children's fabricated lives completely disintegrated. I sat comfortably in Evelyn's study, sipping my morning chamomile tea, watching the undeniable consequences of their greed unfold with mathematical precision. My covert limited liability company had legally absorbed every single one of their toxic debts, transforming me from a grieving father into their ultimate uncompromising creditor. I authorized Jonathan Pierce to ruthlessly execute every financial penalty available under the law. The swiftness of their ruin was spectacular. Damon, who had spent years parading around the city in tailored suits and luxury vehicles, faced the harsh, unforgiving reality of absolute poverty. His landlord, a prominent corporate property management firm, attempted to cash the monthly rent check for his sprawling downtown penthouse. The transaction violently bounced, triggering an immediate and severe financial penalty. Because my corporation now held a total freeze on all his primary banking assets, Damon had absolutely zero liquidity to cover his arrears or secure emergency legal counsel. The property management firm initiated an expedited, merciless eviction process. Within 48 hours, armed municipal sheriffs arrived at his luxury building, physically escorting him out of the lobby and tossing his remaining personal belongings into the street. Connor suffered a similar professionally fatal execution. The arrogant real estate broker, who had proudly brought a fraudulent appraiser into my living room, experienced the swift, brutal wrath of the state licensing board. Following the disastrous memorial dinner, several furious investors filed aggressive formal complaints against his brokerage. Jonathan Pierce expertly expedited the destruction by submitting the crystal-clear audio recordings of Connor actively plotting a multi-million-dollar property scam. The State Real Estate Commission convened an emergency disciplinary hearing. Presented with undeniable documented proof of malicious intent and severe ethical violations, the board ruled unanimously. They stripped Connor of his professional credentials, officially and permanently revoking his real estate license across the entire state. He was barred from ever practicing property law or participating in commercial transactions again. His entire livelihood, built on deception and slick manipulation, evaporated instantly. Their arrogant empire of lies was reduced to absolute ash, leaving them completely exposed to the incoming devastating legal fallout. The civil and financial devastation was only the preliminary phase of my retaliation. The true inescapable trap was officially closing around their throats. Later that same afternoon, Jonathan Pierce strode into my home office carrying his signature black leather briefcase and wearing a deeply satisfied, predatory smile. He took a seat across from my mahogany desk, opened a thick legal dossier, and delivered the exact news I had been patiently waiting to hear. He informed me that the local district attorney had just formally escalated our civil complaints into a massive multi-jurisdictional criminal investigation. The devastating audio files I had meticulously recorded, combined with the fabricated psychiatric documents Meredith had foolishly attempted to leverage, provided the authorities with an insurmountable mountain of undeniable evidence. Jonathan explained that the prosecutors were not merely looking at simple harassment or trespassing charges. They were aggressively pursuing severe, high-level felony indictments for conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation. The state takes crimes against senior citizens with extreme, unrelenting seriousness. By explicitly plotting to drug my food with heavy black market sedatives and steal a property valued at $1.5 million, Damon and Meredith had crossed a dangerous federal line. Jonathan detailed the absolute severity of their impending legal doom. The authorities had already subpoenaed the corrupt, unlicensed psychiatrist Damon had bribed to forge my dementia diagnosis. Faced with the overwhelming threat of a lengthy federal prison sentence, the fraudulent doctor immediately panicked and turned state's evidence. He actively surrendered every single piece of incriminating communication he had shared with my son, trading Damon's freedom for his own legal immunity. The district attorney was officially preparing to file comprehensive charges of gross medical fraud, attempted chemical assault, and criminal conspiracy. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood surface of my desk. He projected his voice with absolute clinical certainty. He told me that my children were no longer simply fighting a wealthy, strategically superior father. They were now actively fighting the entire weight and limitless resources of the federal justice system. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for these specific highly organized felonies virtually guaranteed that Damon, Naomi, Meredith, and Connor would spend a significant portion of their adult lives locked behind reinforced steel bars. There would be absolutely no quiet settlements, no secretive plea deals, and no lenient probation periods. The district attorney wanted to use their high-profile, arrogant conspiracy as a prominent public example to deter other greedy relatives from preying on vulnerable elders. I listened to Jonathan outline their catastrophic future, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the perpetrators. I nodded slowly, authorizing my attorney to cooperate fully with the federal prosecutors and provide every single piece of digital evidence. The legal execution was completely inevitable. As the crushing reality of their federal indictment leaked to the public, the social annihilation of my children was brutally swift. The elite developers who witnessed their spectacular meltdown completely blacklisted them from all high society circles. Damon and Connor were instantly transformed into radioactive pariahs. No reputable firm would ever hire them. No legitimate bank would issue them credit. Their former colleagues severed all communication, banning them from exclusive country clubs. The pristine reputation they spent years fabricating was entirely eradicated, leaving them isolated, impoverished, and publicly shamed. Naomi and Meredith suffered the exact same merciless social execution. Stripped of their stolen designer bags, luxury vehicles, and unlimited credit lines, they were completely ostracized by the wealthy socialites they once desperately tried to impress. They were trapped in an inescapable nightmare of their own malicious design. I spent the remainder of the week operating in total tranquility. Evelyn's estate remained a quiet, impregnable fortress. Late Friday evening, a harsh rainstorm descended upon the city. I sat comfortably in the dimly lit security control room adjacent to the kitchen, monitoring the high-definition live feeds transmitting from the exterior cameras. The iron front gates were securely locked, standing resolute against the freezing downpour. I held a warm cup of coffee, enjoying the profound silence of my home, completely detached from the misery my children were experiencing out in the unforgiving world. Suddenly, a subtle movement caught my attention on the primary driveway monitor. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, narrowing my eyes through the thick static of the torrential rain. The motion sensors silently triggered near the bottom of my property. I watched intently as two shivering figures slowly emerged from the dense shadows. They possessed absolutely no vehicles. They carried no umbrellas to shield themselves. They were completely exposed to the punishing elements. The two figures began trudging heavily up the long, winding asphalt driveway, their heads bowed against the brutal wind. As they staggered closer to the high-resolution lens mounted near the front gate, the security floodlights automatically engaged, casting a harsh white glare across their soaked, miserable faces. The brilliant illumination confirmed their identities instantly. It was Damon and Naomi. Stripped of their arrogant pride, bankrupt and facing imminent federal imprisonment, my treacherous children were desperately crawling back to the man they had tried to destroy. I set my coffee mug down onto the desk, preparing to deliver my final response to their pathetic arrival. I watched the high-definition security feed as my two ruined children approached the formidable wrought-iron security gate. The freezing rain battered their fragile frames relentlessly. Damon gripped the thick metal bars with both hands, his knuckles turning pale against the dark iron. His expensive designer clothes hung heavily on his shivering body, completely soaked and stained with mud. Naomi stood trembling beside him, her hair plastered to her skull, mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streams. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of every single ounce of the arrogant entitlement she had proudly displayed in this exact location just a week prior. Damon reached a shaking hand toward the illuminated intercom panel mounted on the stone pillar. He pressed the call button. The digital chime echoed softly inside my quiet control room. I did not press the button to open the gates. I simply pressed the audio receiver, allowing their desperate voices to filter through the external microphones. Damon began to speak, his voice cracking with sheer panic and profound desperation. He begged me to answer the speaker. He cried loudly into the intercom, claiming they had nowhere else to go. He stated that the federal prosecutors had frozen their last remaining emergency accounts and that Meredith had officially filed for divorce earlier that afternoon, leaving him completely destitute. Naomi leaned closer to the microphone, pushing her brother aside to interject her own pathetic pleas. She sobbed uncontrollably loudly, begging for my forgiveness. She shrieked that she was starving cold and utterly terrified of facing a federal prison sentence. She promised that she had learned her lesson and swore she would be a loyal, obedient daughter if I simply allowed them back inside the warm house. Damon fell entirely to his knees on the wet asphalt, weeping like a broken child. He begged me to just issue a small, temporary loan. He pleaded for just enough cash to secure a cheap motel room and buy a hot meal for the night. He swore he would pay back every single penny with interest. Naomi collapsed onto the muddy ground right next to him, clutching the iron bars, joining his chorus of desperate weeping. They were weaponizing their misery, hoping my paternal instincts would override my logic. I listened to their frantic begging, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the monsters crying in the rain. I quietly left the room. I walked away from the glowing security monitors and moved deliberately through the quiet, darkened house. I climbed the grand oak staircase, my footsteps steady and resolute against the polished timber. I reached the second-floor hallway and approached the heavy glass doors leading directly out to the expansive front balcony. I pushed the doors open, stepping out into the freezing night air. The wide structural awning protected me entirely from the torrential downpour, keeping my clothes perfectly dry while my ruined children suffered in the relentless storm below. I walked forward until my hands rested firmly on the cold stone balustrade. I looked straight down at the main security gates. Damon and Naomi heard the heavy glass doors open above them. They instantly stopped their frantic weeping and tilted their soaked heads upward, peering through the heavy darkness and the driving rain. Their eyes widened with sudden, desperate hope as they finally saw my silhouette towering over them. They believed their manipulative, theatrical performance had successfully broken my resolve. Naomi immediately began screaming my name again, clutching the iron bars and begging me to please buzz them inside. Damon clasped his hands together in a pathetic gesture of prayer, shouting over the loud crack of thunder that they were deeply sorry for everything they had done. I stood absolutely still, projecting an aura of total uncompromising authority. I did not raise my voice to compete with the roaring storm. I simply spoke with a cold, piercing clarity that cut effortlessly through the freezing rain and reached their ears with devastating precision. I told them to stop polluting my property with their manufactured grief. I stared directly into Damon's terrified eyes and stated that their mother would be profoundly disgusted by their pathetic, weaponized tears. I reminded them that Evelyn had spent her entire life building a legacy of strength, resilience, and unyielding integrity. She had worked tirelessly to secure a fortune designed to elevate this family, not to fund a lazy, parasitic existence. I declared that their current display of groveling weakness was the ultimate insult to her memory. I told Naomi that she was insulting the very concept of motherhood by invoking Evelyn's name just to secure a cheap motel room. I informed them both that they were not shedding tears because they felt any genuine remorse for plotting to chemically destroy my mind and steal my estate. They were crying simply because they had been caught outsmarted and completely financially eradicated. I stated that true repentance requires absolute accountability, and they possessed absolutely zero moral character. I stood on the balcony staring down at their miserable forms with a gaze completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a rolled-up newspaper I had requested Jonathan Pierce bring to the estate that morning. It was a cheap, daily circular distributed throughout the working-class neighborhoods of the city. I had taken a red marker and drawn bright circles around 3 advertisements printed within the employment classified section. They were active job listings for overnight commercial janitorial positions demanding physical labor, scraping floors and scrubbing toilets for minimum wage. I held the newspaper tightly, feeling the rough texture against my skin. I looked down at Damon and Naomi, who were staring up at me with their mouths open in silent shock. They finally realized my rejection was absolute and non-negotiable. I did not offer a parting platitude or a false promise of reconciliation. I leaned over the cold stone balustrade, extending my arm into the freezing night air. I deliberately released my grip, allowing the newspaper to fall freely from the second-floor balcony. The bound paper plummeted quickly through the driving rain, spiraling downward toward the main security gates. It landed with a loud splash directly into a deep, muddy puddle forming on the wet asphalt mere inches from Damon's ruined shoes. The impact forced the rubber band holding the paper together to snap open. The saturated pages unrolled across the muddy ground, revealing the employment classified section illuminated by the harsh glare of the exterior security floodlights. The bright red circles I had drawn around the janitorial job listings were impossible to miss. I looked down at them one last time, my voice echoing with icy finality. I told them dignity fundamentally starts with earning an honest dollar, and that their education began tonight. I did not wait for their responses. I turned my back on my ruined children, stepping away from the stone balustrade. I walked back inside the warm house, pulling the heavy glass doors tightly shut behind me. Down below at the security gates, Damon and Naomi stared blankly at the soaked newspaper resting in the mud. The crushing reality of their sudden, inescapable poverty completely paralyzed them. Stripped of every ounce of their arrogant pride, they finally accepted their total defeat. They slowly turned around, leaving the heavy iron gates behind them. They trudged silently down the empty street, walking away into the cold, freezing darkness entirely erased from my life. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a crisp, cloudless morning that felt like a rebirth. I stood in the center of the grand living room, the exact spot where I had systematically dismantled my children's fraudulent empire, and looked around the vast, empty space. The house was entirely mine, secure and silent, but the echoing rooms suddenly felt devoid of a true purpose. Evelyn and I had built our covert fortune to elevate our family, but since my bloodline had proven themselves entirely unworthy of that legacy, I decided to redirect our immense capital toward a far more honorable mission. I contacted several high-end contracting firms in order to complete structural remodeling of the entire ground floor of my estate. I instructed the builders to tear down the ornate partition walls, remove the antique chandeliers, and replace the plush residential carpeting with durable commercial flooring. Within 3 weeks, the luxurious living spaces my children had so greedily coveted were completely transformed into a sleek, modern, fully functional professional workspace. I called Jonathan Pierce and presented him with a massive, unprecedented philanthropic proposal. I officially established the Evelyn Wright Foundation, funding it directly with the millions of dollars I had secured through the Ironclad Trust. I offered Jonathan the ground floor of my estate to serve as a dedicated pro bono legal clinic, completely subsidized by my corporation. The mission was specific, aggressive, and deeply personal. We were going to provide top-tier legal defense exclusively for minority elders who were actively facing severe financial exploitation from predatory family members. Jonathan eagerly accepted the mandate, immediately dispatching 3 of his sharpest, most relentless junior associates to permanently staff the clinic. They set up their workstations where the grand dining table used to sit, transforming my home into a fortified sanctuary for the vulnerable. They took on cases of forged power of attorney documents, contested wills, and hostile property takeovers, fighting back against greedy children who viewed their aging parents as nothing more than disposable bank accounts. I walked through the clinic every morning, watching the young attorneys aggressively file injunctions and freeze stolen assets on behalf of terrified, desperate seniors. The house was no longer a silent monument to my personal grief. It was an active, heavily funded war room generating absolute justice, ensuring Evelyn's incredible legacy permanently survived to protect those who desperately needed our unyielding legal authority today. While the legal team battled aggressively on the ground floor, I retreated to the large detached garage located at the rear edge of the property. For decades, this space had remained completely dormant, acting merely as a storage facility for expensive vehicles I rarely bothered to drive. I hired a specialized crew to clear out the luxury cars and completely renovate the interior, converting the empty structure back into a fully operational, professional-grade carpentry workshop. I purchased heavy-duty industrial saws, high-powered sanders, and premium drafting tables. The sharp, nostalgic smell of freshly cut timber and rich wood stain instantly filled the air, providing a profound sense of grounding therapy I had not experienced since my youth. I rolled up the sleeves of my simple flannel shirts and returned to the foundational physical labor that had originally built my character. I was no longer manipulating vast corporate real estate portfolios or managing millions of dollars in covert offshore investments. I was simply a man working with his own two hands, shaping raw materials into something genuinely valuable and entirely real. I spent my days meticulously measuring, cutting, and assembling heavy, solid oak dining tables, sturdy pine bookshelves, and incredibly durable maple bed frames. I poured my absolute focus into ensuring every single joint was perfectly reinforced and every surface was flawlessly polished. I was physically constructing the immense structural stability I wished I could have successfully built into my own ruined family. Once I finished a large batch of custom furniture, I loaded the heavy wooden pieces into the back of my rugged utility truck. I completely bypassed the wealthy neighborhoods and drove directly to the underfunded community orphanages and struggling youth shelters located on the neglected outskirts of the city. These specific facilities were perpetually operating on razor-thin municipal budgets, leaving vulnerable children to sleep on broken cots and study on splintered plastic tables. I personally delivered my handcrafted furniture, replacing their damaged equipment with immaculate, indestructible wooden fixtures designed to last for generations. The sheer, unadulterated gratitude radiating from the facility directors and the bright, enthusiastic smiles of the young children provided a deep healing balm to my fractured soul. I was actively replacing the toxic, parasitic greed of my own bloodline with a profound community of genuine respect and unconditional support. The heavy physical labor purged the lingering bitterness from my chest, while the philanthropic deliveries restored my fundamental faith in human decency. I spent my afternoons quietly sweeping sawdust off the concrete floor, listening to the rhythmic hum of the clinic operating efficiently inside the main house. I had successfully transformed my personal tragedy into a highly organized machine generating tangible, absolute support. 6 months passed since the heavy iron gates of my estate permanently locked out the treacherous remnants of my former family. The freezing winter gave way to a scorching summer. My life settled into an incredibly peaceful, highly productive rhythm, entirely devoid of the toxic manipulation that had plagued my existence. My body felt strong, invigorated by daily carpentry work, and my mind was exceptionally clear, unburdened by my children's reckless disasters. The pro bono legal clinic on the ground floor was thriving aggressively, dismantling fraudulent conservatorships across the state, while I continued to build solid oak furniture for local orphanages. Early one Tuesday afternoon, I loaded a massive, intricately carved mahogany bookshelf into the bed of my utility truck. I secured the heavy wooden structure with thick industrial cargo straps and merged onto the congested interstate, heading toward a newly established youth center located within the downtown commercial district. The intense midday sun beat down relentlessly onto the pavement, radiating suffocating waves of thick, visible heat across the crowded asphalt. I navigated through the chaotic downtown traffic, my air conditioning running at maximum capacity, keeping the interior of my truck perfectly cool. I turned onto a heavily congested industrial avenue and gently pressed the brakes, pulling my heavy vehicle to a complete stop at a glowing red traffic light. I rested my arm casually against the steering wheel, waiting patiently for the intersection to clear. Directly to my right, a massive commercial construction site was operating at full capacity. Heavy machinery roared loudly, drowning out the surrounding city noise, while dozens of exhausted laborers hauled heavy materials across the dusty, unforgiving terrain. The grueling physical demands of the site were glaringly obvious under the oppressive, blistering heat. I casually glanced through my tinted passenger side window, observing the chaotic movement of the workers carrying large steel rebar beams. Suddenly, a very specific figure caught my immediate attention. The man was struggling to carry two massive 80-pound bags of dry concrete mix across the uneven dirt path. He wore a bright yellow safety hard hat, a neon-reflective vest, and a sweat-soaked gray t-shirt clinging tightly to his exhausted, hunched frame. The dust and grime thickly coated his face, masking his features, but the familiar, arrogant slope of his shoulders was absolutely undeniable. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes, observing him gasp for air, and recognized him. It was Damon, the former executive who once strutted through my foyer wearing custom-tailored Italian suits now stood knee-deep in commercial construction dust. He dropped the heavy 80-pound bags of dry concrete mix onto a wooden pallet with a loud, heavy thud. A thick cloud of gray, toxic powder exploded upward, coating his sweating face and sticking to his eyelashes. He hunched over, resting his raw, blistered hands on his knees while he gasped desperately for air. The brutal, unforgiving reality of manual labor had completely eroded his arrogant posture. His face, once perfectly moisturized and arrogant, was deeply weathered by constant exposure to the blistering sun. Deep, harsh lines framed his mouth, and his cheeks were hollowed out by genuine, agonizing fatigue. He looked entirely broken, stripped of the unearned luxury that previously shielded him from the harsh consequences of the real world. A loud, booming whistle echoed across the chaotic construction site. A burly foreman wearing a white hard hat shouted aggressively at Damon, ordering him to stop wasting time and haul another load of materials before his scheduled break. Damon did not argue. He did not puff out his chest or attempt to assert any fabricated superiority. He simply wiped his dripping forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve, nodded submissively, and turned back toward the massive supply truck. He was a low-level laborer, trapped in a brutal cycle of survival, earning minimum wage just to afford his next meal. I watched him struggle to lift the next pair of heavy concrete bags, his arms shaking violently under the immense physical strain. This was the exact environment I grew up in. This was the grueling, back-breaking foundation that built my character and secured our family fortune. Damon spent his entire life mocking my blue-collar origins, viewing my carpentry skills as an embarrassing flaw. He believed he was inherently superior, simply because Evelyn and I provided him with a comfortable childhood. Now stripped of his stolen credit cards and his fraudulent real estate portfolio, he was forced to endure the exact same physical punishment he had always despised. The blazing heat beat down relentlessly on his shoulders, crushing his spirit with every single step he took across the uneven dirt path. He was finally experiencing the crushing weight of absolute accountability every single minute of his miserable day. The sight was sobering. As I sat securely within the air-conditioned cabin of my truck, I recalled the detailed status update Jonathan Pierce delivered to my office just 2 days ago. My attorney thoroughly monitored the legal and social fallout surrounding the conspirators, ensuring their destruction remained absolutely permanent. Jonathan revealed that Meredith officially filed for divorce the very morning Damon was brutally evicted from his downtown penthouse. She did not hesitate to abandon her ruined husband. Stripped of the fraudulent wealth she so desperately coveted, Meredith instantly detached herself from the sinking ship. According to Jonathan, she aggressively pursued an older, significantly wealthy corporate investor, hoping to quickly secure a new financial host to fund her extravagant lifestyle. However, her malicious exit strategy contained a massive, devastating flaw for Damon. During their marriage, Meredith secretly accumulated massive amounts of hidden credit card debt under joint accounts. When she finalized the divorce filings and relocated to a different state with her new wealthy benefactor, she legally saddled Damon with the entirety of that crushing financial burden. He was now solely responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured liabilities, completely eradicating any microscopic chance he possessed of rebuilding his credit score or escaping absolute poverty. His former wife left him rotting in the dirt, effectively ruining his financial future for the next 20 years. Jonathan also provided a comprehensive update regarding Connor's ongoing criminal proceedings. The arrogant real estate broker who once threatened to lock me inside a psychiatric facility was currently experiencing the full, terrifying weight of the federal justice system. the district attorney formally indicted Connor on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, and severe corporate racketeering. The judge deemed him a significant flight risk and aggressively denied him bail. Connor was currently sitting inside a maximum security county detention center, nervously awaiting his official criminal trial. His former wealthy investors were actively collaborating with the federal prosecutors, enthusiastically providing sworn testimonies to ensure Connor received the maximum possible prison sentence. His entire life was reduced to a sterile concrete cell and a bright orange jumpsuit. The absolute supremacy of Evelyn's covert trust document had systematically neutralized every single threat they posed to our family legacy. They arrogantly walked into my home believing they could easily overpower a grieving widow and a retired carpenter. Instead, they unknowingly triggered an aggressive legal avalanche that violently erased their careers, their marriages, and their freedom. I processed Jonathan's thorough report with cold, calculating satisfaction. Every single consequence they were currently suffering was a direct, undeniable result of their own malicious greed. I did not engineer their profound misery. I merely stopped shielding them from the brutal consequences. The deafening blast of a heavy dump truck horn jolted my attention back to the grueling scene unfolding beyond my tinted passenger side window. Damon dropped another massive bag of dry concrete mix onto the splintered wooden pallet, his exhausted arms trembling violently under the overwhelming physical strain. He wiped his sweating, grime-covered forehead with the back of his dirty glove and slowly turned his head toward the busy intersection. His bloodshot eyes scanned the congested row of vehicles idling at the red light, aimlessly searching the chaotic traffic for a brief moment of mental escape. As his weary gaze swept across the lane directly parallel to the commercial construction site, his eyes suddenly locked onto my heavy utility truck. He recognized the robust vehicle instantly. The dense, toxic gray dust coating his face could not conceal the sheer paralyzing shock that forcefully widened his eyes. He stood completely frozen amidst the loud roar of heavy machinery, staring directly at me through the thick, sun-baked glass. This was the exact man who had aggressively shoved a fraudulent property transfer deed into my chest just 6 months ago. He had arrogantly stood in my pristine foyer, threatening to lock me inside a psychiatric ward while his greedy wife mocked the scent of my home. Now he was a broken, bankrupt laborer staring at the father who systematically orchestrated his total financial annihilation. I sat perfectly upright in my comfortable air-conditioned cabin, resting both hands firmly on the leather steering wheel. I did not sneer at his pathetic condition. I did not offer a small, sympathetic smile to comfort his misery. I felt absolutely zero paternal obligation to acknowledge his tragic self-inflicted downfall. I maintained a cold, completely unreadable expression projecting the absolute uncompromising authority that defined my ultimate victory over his toxic betrayal. I stared directly back into his panicked eyes for exactly 3 seconds, ensuring he fully absorbed the devastating reality of our reversed positions permanently. I then calmly reached forward and pressed the control button on my heavy door panel. The tinted electric window smoothly rolled up, sealing the thick glass tight and permanently cutting off our final visual connection. The traffic light shifted to bright green. I gently pressed the accelerator smoothly, driving away from the construction site, leaving my ruined son behind to balance the eternal, brutal cosmic scales of absolute justice forever alone. I steered the heavy utility truck back up the long, winding asphalt driveway, the iron security gate sealing shut behind me with a reassuring metallic thud. The vast estate was perfectly quiet, bathed in the warm golden glow of the late afternoon sun. I walked through the grand foyer, bypassing the bustling legal clinic operating smoothly on the ground floor, and ascended the polished oak staircase. I entered my private study, closing the heavy wooden door to block out the faint sounds of ringing telephones and rustling legal documents. The room was perfectly still, smelling faintly of old paper and rich mahogany. I walked directly toward the center of the room and stood before the large, oil-painted portrait of Evelyn that hung above the stone fireplace. Her sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to pierce through the canvas, radiating the exact same fierce, protective energy that had defined her entire existence. I clasped my hands firmly behind my back, standing tall and resolute, and spoke aloud to the empty room. I told my beloved wife that the war she had so brilliantly anticipated was finally and permanently over. I assured her that the ironclad trust had operated with flawless, devastating precision. I confirmed that her meticulous covert financial architecture had successfully repelled the malicious invasion orchestrated by the very children we had brought into this world. I looked at the slight painted smile on her lips and promised her that our immense legacy was absolutely safe from their toxic parasitic greed. I explained that the vile, corrosive rot that had infected our bloodline was now entirely excised, surgically removed from our estate and our history. I told her that Damon and Naomi were officially banished to the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of their own consequences, stripped of the unearned luxury they had weaponized against us. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of grief, replaced entirely by a profound, unshakable peace. I promised Evelyn that the wealth we had built through decades of sweat sacrifice and unbreakable partnership would never be squandered on arrogant entitlement. It was now firmly secured, redirected toward a noble, enduring purpose that honored the profound integrity of the life we had shared. Our fortress remained standing, impenetrable and pristine. I told her that every single threat they posed had been neutralized with absolute, uncompromising legal authority. The estate was secure, our memories were protected, and the foundation we laid was stronger than ever. I turned away from the painting and walked toward the expansive bay window overlooking the manicured gardens. Staring out at the vibrant, blooming flowers, my mind settled into a sharp, crystalline reflection. Society tirelessly preaches the dangerous, romanticized concept of unconditional love. We are constantly conditioned to believe that shared DNA automatically demands infinite forgiveness, endless financial sacrifice, and total emotional submission. We are told to endure disrespect, manipulation, and profound cruelty simply because the perpetrators carry our last name. I completely reject that fabricated, toxic narrative. Unconditional love is an absolute myth when it actively demands the total sacrifice of your fundamental human dignity. Blood simply dictates the initial biological connection, but it absolutely does not guarantee a permanent lifetime subscription to my resources or my emotional sanctuary. Family is not determined by birth certificates or inherited traits. True family is built entirely upon a rigid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and clearly defined boundaries. Damon and Naomi believed that my parental obligations bound me to a lifetime of financial servitude. They assumed my love for them was a fatal weakness they could easily exploit for personal gain. They were fundamentally wrong. I realized that continuously shielding toxic individuals from the natural consequences of their own malicious actions is not an act of love. It is an act of sheer self-destruction. I refused to let my twilight years be consumed by their ruthless greed. I refused to become a silent, trembling victim locked away in a psychiatric ward just so they could fund their fabricated luxury lifestyles. By decisively severing their access to my wealth, I did not just protect my bank accounts. I forcefully reclaimed my autonomy, my mental clarity, and my absolute right to exist without constant fear or manipulation. The pain of completely disowning my own children was undeniably severe, but it was a strictly temporary agony. Remaining tethered to their parasitic, venomous existence would have been an eternal, soul-crushing prison. I learned the hardest, most vital lesson a father could ever learn. You cannot save people who view you as nothing more than a disposable asset. You can only save yourself by having the immense, terrifying courage to walk away and let the brutal reality of the real world teach them the lessons you no longer can. Dignity is the ultimate boundary, and I had successfully defended mine with absolute, unapologetic ruthlessness. I stood by the window feeling a profound, limitless freedom that only comes from excising the poison from your own life completely. My deep internal reflection was suddenly interrupted by the sharp melodic chime of the heavy brass doorbell echoing up from the grand foyer below. I turned away from the window, adjusting the cuffs of my flannel shirt, and walked purposefully out of the quiet study. I descended the polished oak staircase, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps blending with the low, steady hum of legal consultations happening inside the newly renovated ground-floor clinic. Jonathan Pierce's junior associates were already busy at their desks reviewing complex property deeds and drafting aggressive restraining orders against predatory relatives. I bypassed the main reception desk and walked directly toward the heavy front double doors. I reached forward and pulled the thick wooden panels inward, letting the bright afternoon sunlight flood into the entryway. Standing on my front porch were two elderly individuals. The man gripped a worn wooden cane, his knuckles white with tension, while his wife clung tightly to his other arm. They wore faded, outdated clothing, and their faces were etched with deep, terrifying exhaustion. Their eyes darted nervously around the expansive, wealthy estate, clearly intimidated by the grand surroundings. I instantly recognized the profound, paralyzing fear radiating from their fragile postures. It was the exact same raw, suffocating terror I had felt months ago when my own children aggressively ambushed me in this very hallway. They had been manipulated, threatened, and financially backed into a corner by the people they trusted most in the world. They were desperately searching for a lifeline, a safe harbor against the overwhelming darkness of family betrayal. I did not stand tall and project cold, intimidating authority. I softened my shoulders, maintaining a posture of genuine protective warmth. A sincere, deeply empathetic smile spread across my face. I looked directly into their anxious eyes and spoke with a calm, reassuring gentleness that instantly shattered their apprehension. I welcomed them to the Evelyn Wright Foundation. I assured them that they had found exactly the right place and that they were completely safe now. I extended my hand, gently ushering the frightened couple over the threshold and into the bright, bustling legal sanctuary. As they stepped safely inside, I grabbed the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. I pushed them firmly outward, closing the thick wood against the harsh, unforgiving outside world. I engaged the heavy deadbolt with a solid, definitive click. True power does not announce its presence. It quietly observes until the time to strike is absolute. We often confuse silence with weakness, assuming that those who endure disrespect are fundamentally incapable of defending themselves. Yet the most devastating corrections always come from those who allow greed to dig its own grave. Entitlement blinds people to the consequences of their actions, making them believe that familial bonds grant immunity from strict accountability. When you strip away unearned luxury, you expose the hollow core hiding beneath. Ultimately, setting brutal boundaries is never an act of cruelty, but a vital survival tactic. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace and dignity from toxic family members? Let us know how you handled it by sharing your own experiences in the comments section below. If Tobias's silent correction and absolute justice satisfied you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of reclaimed power and brilliant revenge.